A little before sunrise on a Saturday morning in North Carolina, a police captain slowed his cruiser beside a red Jeep, sitting crooked on the shoulder of a dark highway. The engine was still running. The headlights were still aimed down the road, and when he walked up to the open driver's window, there was no driver at all. Then from inside the empty Jeep, a cell phone started ringing. The captain leaned in, stared at the phone on the passenger seat, and answered it. A man on the other end said, "Where is my wife?" And in that moment, before anybody understood what had happened, the road already knew something the police did not. Now, before we get into it, if you like the strange, dark and mysterious told in story format, then you are in the right place. Today we have 12 stories, but we are starting with one that looks like a traffic stop, then slowly becomes something much worse. So subscribe if that sounds like your kind of late night listening. Also tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. And if the like button asks you for a ride home tonight, go ahead and say yes, but then drive exactly 1 mile per hour under the speed limit while humming quietly and refusing to explain why. All right, turn the lights down. Let's begin on a lonely road outside Charlotte. In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29th, 1997, a 26-year-old woman named Kim Medlin carried a tray of steaks through a smoky men's club in Charlotte, North Carolina. Kim was blonde, quick on her feet, and tired in the way people get when they are young, but already building a life. Kim worked nights as a waitress because the money was good and because her days were already full. She and her husband Bridger had just bought a small piece of land outside Monroe, where they were building the kind of home they had talked about for years. There was room for their horses, room for quiet, and room for the future to finally feel close. But the job came with one thing Kim hated, and that was the drive home. Every shift ended after 2 in the morning, and the route back to Monroe took her down long stretches of dark road where there were no crowds, no porch lights, and sometimes no other cars for minutes at a time. Most nights she told herself it was fine. Recently it had not felt fine. A couple of weeks earlier, Kim had been driving home on that same road when another car came up behind her and started riding her bumper. The driver honked again and again for no reason Kim could understand. She got so scared that she pulled into a convenience store where she saw a police car walk straight to the officer and asked for help. The officer took the complaint seriously. He and another officer later stopped the men in the other car who claimed the whole thing was just a misunderstanding. Still, the police put out a notice over the radio telling officers to keep an eye out for Kim's red Jeep on the nights she worked late, and that made Kim feel safer at least a little. So on this night when her shift finally ended, a little after 2, Kim changed out of her work clothes, pulled on a baggy sweatshirt, and stepped out into the cool air behind the club. She called goodbye to her co-workers, climbed into her red Jeep, dropped her purse on the passenger seat, and started the long drive home. About halfway there, Kim's nerves started to rise again. The highway was empty and black, and every reflection in the mirror felt sharper than it should have. So she reached into her purse, pulled out her cell phone and called Bridger. He answered right away and told her he was on the road too, driving home from a DJ job at a school dance. They talked for a few minutes, just normal husband and wife talk at the end of a long night. Bridger told her he was almost home, and once he got inside, he would call her back. Kim said, "Okay," hung up and kept driving. For a few minutes, the only sound in the Jeep was the engine and the low music coming from the speakers. A little before 3 in the morning, Bridger called back like he promised. He asked where she was, and Kim told him she had just passed a restaurant she knew, which meant she was maybe 20 minutes from the house. Bridger said he was exhausted and might be asleep when she got in, so he told her goodnight. Kim told him goodnight too. Then she set the phone down on the passenger seat, and right as she looked back toward the road, a bright glare filled her rearview mirror. A vehicle had come up behind her, fast, so close that its headlights washed out the inside of her Jeep. Kim stared into the mirror, and for a second all she could see was light. About an hour later, Bridger opened his eyes in bed and looked at the clock. It was just before 4 in the morning. Kim should have been home long ago. At first he tried to stay calm because maybe she had stopped for gas or maybe she had talked with somebody after work. But when he walked through the house and did not find her, that calm feeling disappeared. Bridger looked out the window and saw the driveway was empty. Then he hurried into the kitchen, grabbed the phone and dialed Kim's cell. It rang several times. Finally, a man answered. Bridger did not recognize the voice, so he said, "Who is this?" And the man said he was a police officer with Monroe Public Safety. Bridger froze. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Where is my wife?" The officer told him he did not know. He said he had just found a red Jeep idling on the shoulder of Old Charlotte Highway. The headlights were on, the driver's window was down, and Kim's phone had been sitting on the passenger seat when it rang. Within minutes, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk was driving toward the edge of Monroe. Hulk knew Bridger personally, so when the call came in, it did not feel like a random missing driver. It felt like somebody he knew had just stepped into a nightmare. When he arrived, he saw the Jeep on the shoulder and a patrol car parked behind it. Captain David Simpson was already there. He explained that he had found the Jeep empty engine, running no sign of Kim, no obvious crash, no broken glass and no blood inside. Hulk shined his flashlight across the seats and saw Kim's wallet lying open. Her credit cards and cash were still there, but the slot where her driver's license should have been was empty. That detail bothered Hulk right away. A missing license could mean Kim had handed it to somebody, and on a dark highway at 3 a.m, the most obvious person she would hand a license to was a police officer. Hulk asked if any Monroe officer had pulled anyone over that night. The answer came back quickly. No one had. Just then, headlights rolled up behind the police cars. Bridger stepped out of his pickup, looking frantic and angry and terrified all at once. He demanded to know what had happened to Kim. Hulk tried to slow him down, but Bridger pushed past him and climbed straight into Kim's Jeep, saying he wanted to see if it worked. Hulk told him to get out of the vehicle, but Bridger ignored him. He put the Jeep in drive, moved it forward, then backed it into place. The vehicle ran perfectly. That meant Kim had not abandoned it because of engine trouble. And even though Bridger had just contaminated part of the scene, Hulk understood why he did it. He was trying to make the same fear visible to everyone else. A police dog was brought in, and after smelling Kim's belongings, it picked up a trail along the road. The officers followed the dog for about 100 yards until it turned into a long driveway leading to a small house near the highway. The dog went right up to the garage and stopped as if Kim's scent had ended there. The man who lived there came to the door looking awake, not confused in the way someone usually looks when police knock before dawn. He said his name was Nathan, and about an hour earlier, he had seen a strange car near his garage. He said it had Texas plates and there had been a blonde woman in the back seat. Hulk asked to search the property, and Nathan agreed. The officers searched the house, the garage, and the area around it, but they found no Kim. Nathan's story did not make him look like the killer, but it gave police a new fear. Maybe Kim had been taken from the Jeep, put into another car, and driven away. And if that was true, every minute mattered, because no one knew whether she was alive. By sunrise, the case had become a full missing person investigation. Volunteers came out to search the woods. Officers checked nearby roads, ditches and parking lots. Hulk and Simpson went back to the station and started looking for any report that might connect to a car with Texas plates, a fake traffic stop, or anything strange in the area that night. One call stood out, but only barely. Around 2 that morning, a car had slid into a ditch not far from where Kim's Jeep was later found. A rookie officer named Josh Griffin had responded. When Hulk called him, Josh said his shift was basically over by then, so he called a tow truck, waited until the situation was handled, and went home. That seemed unrelated. Kim had still been on the phone with Bridger close to 3 long after the ditch call had cleared. So Hulk circled back to the older road rage incident from 2 weeks earlier. It was too strange to ignore. Same road, same time of night, same woman, same fear that someone had noticed her pattern and followed her. Hulk tracked down the 2 men from the earlier road rage complaint. Both had alibis for the night Kim vanished. That lead died. Then investigators looked at Bridger because in a murder case, the spouse is never skipped. Bridger had been emotional, pushy, and way too eager to touch the Jeep, and one officer thought he had seen Bridger's truck in town earlier than he claimed. When Hulk questioned him, Bridger exploded. He said he could not believe police were wasting time on him while Kim was missing, or dead. Then he said something that stayed with Hulk. Kim would never get out of her Jeep at 3 a.m. for a stranger. Not after what had happened 2 weeks earlier. She was scared. She was careful. And Hulk knew Bridger was right. Kim probably would not have stepped out for some random man on a lonely road, but she might have stepped out for her husband. She might have stepped out for someone she knew. And she almost certainly would have stepped out for a police officer, especially if she believed police were already watching out for her. Then the next evening, 2 searchers found something at the end of a dead-end road called Westwood Industrial Drive. The area was known locally as a place where people went to be alone. Under roofing shingles and branches, In a small clearing near the trees, they found Kim's body. She was still wearing her sweatshirt, but it had been pulled and twisted around her. Hulk knelt near her body with his flashlight. Kim had not been robbed. Her wedding ring was still there, her necklace was still there. There were injuries to her face and neck, and scrapes on her knees as if she had fought hard or been dragged. Then, as a crime scene tech lifted her sweatshirt into an evidence bag, Hulk saw something on the fabric. It was a shoe print. Not a vague smudge, but a clear tread impression pressed into the cloth. Hulk told the tech to stop and bag it carefully. At that moment, he did not know whose shoe had made that mark, but he knew it could be the kind of small, ugly detail that turns a case around after every bigger clue fails. Over the next few days, the investigation moved in circles. Bridger's alibi, held up after camera footage, showed the officer who thought he saw his truck had been wrong. Kim's co-workers could not name any customer who had threatened her. The road rage suspect stayed cleared. The car with Texas plates never turned into a solid lead. But one witness gave Hulk something important. A night shift worker near Old Charlotte Highway said he saw Kim's red Jeep pass just before 3. Right after that, another vehicle going the opposite direction made a sharp turn and sped after her. The witness thought it looked like a police car because it had lights on the roof and reflective markings. That made the blue light bandit theory feel almost certain. Someone had used flashing lights to make Kim pull over. Someone had made her think she was dealing with law enforcement. Police checked nearby reports of fake officers stopping women, but those leads went nowhere too, and then the lab called about the shoe print. The tread had a distinct V-shaped pattern. It came from a boot made by Thorogood, a company that supplied military and uniform footwear. More importantly, that exact model had been issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department. Hulk listened to the lab expert, and suddenly the shape of the case changed completely. The killer was not necessarily pretending to be a police officer. The killer might actually be one. And once Hulk understood that the quiet little details lined up in a different way, the missing license, the open window, the clean stop, the lack of a fight at the Jeep, Kim had obeyed because she believed she had to. Investigators focused on Officer Josh Griffin, the rookie who had been out near the area earlier that night. Josh's father, Roger Griffin, was also an officer, and Roger had been one of the men who spoke with Kim during the road rage incident 2 weeks before. Through that, Josh had learned about Kim's Jeep, her route, and the fact that she drove alone late at night. What police believe happened is painfully simple. Around 3 in the morning, Josh saw Kim's red Jeep and followed it. He turned on his lights and Kim pulled over. She rolled down her window. He walked up like an officer conducting a normal stop, and she handed him her driver's license because that is what a person does when police ask. Then Josh ordered her out of the Jeep. Kim was confused, but she stepped out. He put handcuffs on her and forced her into his vehicle. In the back seat, Kim cried and asked what she had done wrong, but Josh did not have a real answer. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks, and now that it was happening, he had no plan that made sense. At some point, he drove toward a secluded road. Kim realized this was not an arrest. This was something else. Her hands were cuffed, but she managed to work at the rear door, and when the car slowed, she threw herself out. She hit the road hard and tried to get away, but Josh stopped, ran back, and attacked her with a flashlight. Police believe he beat her, stomped on her, and strangled her before dragging her into the woods. Then he removed the handcuffs, covered her with branches and debris, and went home to clean up whatever he could. But in the struggle, his boot came down on her sweatshirt and left behind the one thing he did not know he had given them. Josh Griffin was arrested about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for why he did it, there was no clean explanation, no grand motive, no secret robbery, no affair, no revenge. The closest answer was the coldest one. He had become obsessed with her, and the hardest part is that Kim had tried to be careful. She had reported the road rage. She had trusted the police. She had called her husband while she drove because she knew that road could feel wrong at night. But when the lights appeared behind her, the thing she thought meant help was exactly what made her stop. So in the end, the image that stays is not the courtroom or the arrest. It is that red Jeep on the shoulder before dawn engine, humming headlights shining into empty road phone, ringing on the seat. Bridger called because he wanted to hear his wife's voice. Instead, a police officer answered, standing beside the silence another police officer had created. A road can hide what happened for a while because headlights pass engines fade and the dark closes behind every car. But some secrets do not sit on asphalt. Some moved through pipes, through kitchens, through pots of boiling water, until an entire town realizes that the strange taste in the food was never coming from the food at all. On a grey afternoon in December of 1999 inside a small restaurant in southwestern China, a manager named Li Hao stood behind the counter and listened as another customer shouted that his lunch tasted so bad, even pigs would refuse it. Li bowed, apologized, and offered the meal for free. But as the angry man stormed out, Li looked around and realized every table in the restaurant was empty. At first, Li tried to tell himself this was just one of those terrible days that happened in food service. Maybe the chef had used too much salt. Maybe a sauce had gone sour. Maybe one bad plate had turned into gossip. And now everybody was finding something wrong because everybody else had. But here's the thing. This was not the first complaint that day. It was not even the fifth. By late afternoon, Li had heard the same thing from nearly every table. The noodles tasted bitter. The soup smelled wrong. The rice had a strange aftertaste that nobody could describe without making a face. And each time Li apologized and smiled through it, but inside he was starting to panic because a restaurant can survive a bad night. It cannot survive if people think the kitchen is poisoning them. So when the last customer left, Li turned toward the back of the restaurant and walked straight into the kitchen. The chef was standing at the prep counter, chopping vegetables like nothing was wrong. Li slammed the kitchen door behind him and said, "You better tell me what happened today." The chef set the knife down slowly, raised both hands and said, "It is not me." That only made Li angrier. He told the chef every customer had complained. He said the food tasted strange, the dining room had emptied out, and if the chef had changed a recipe or used spoiled ingredients, he needed to say so right now. But the chef kept shaking his head. He said the vegetables were fresh, the meat had been delivered that morning, and he had cooked every dish the same way he always did. Then the chef said something that made Li stop yelling. He said he had already spoken with 2 other cooks nearby, and they were having the same problem. Their customers were complaining too. Different restaurants, different menus, different kitchens, but the same strange taste. So whatever was happening, the chef said it was not just inside Li's restaurant. The next morning, Li met with several other restaurant managers in the neighborhood. They stood in a small group outside one of the shops, talking over one another and comparing complaints. One place served noodles, another served steamed fish, another served rice porridge. None of them shared the same suppliers for meat or vegetables. But after a few minutes, one common detail rose to the surface. They all used water from the same local supplier. Not bottled water, not a private well, but water that came from a storage tower on a hill above the neighborhood. At first, that sounded almost too simple. Water was in everything. It went into soup rice, tea sauces, steamed buns, and every pot that sat over a flame. If the water tasted wrong, then everything would taste wrong. So the managers called the supplier and demanded somebody inspect the storage tower. Later that same day, a worker named Yang Guayo was sent up the hill to take a look. Yang did not expect anything dramatic. Maybe sediment had built up in the tank. Maybe rats had gotten into the building. Maybe some chemical used for cleaning had not been flushed properly. It would be unpleasant but fixable. The path to the tower was steep and rough, cutting up through scrubby ground outside the busier part of town. Yang walked with a flashlight in one hand and a small tool bag in the other, already thinking about how annoying this inspection was going to be. The tower itself was a tall concrete structure with a metal ladder bolted to the side. From the ground it looked ordinary. Yang climbed the ladder slowly. The metal was rusty enough that he tested each rung before putting his full weight on it. At the top, he reached a small access door, pulled it open, and immediately smelled something that made him turn his head away. It was thick and sour and wrong, but because water towers could smell bad for boring reasons, he forced himself to keep going. Inside the space was dark except for the beam of his flashlight. Yang swept the light across the walls, expecting to see stains nests, maybe dead animals near the edges. But at first he did not see rats or birds. He saw water concrete pipes, and then just a few steps in front of him, a large canvas bag sitting where no bag should have been. Yang stared at it for several seconds. The bag was soaked and heavy-looking, slumped against the floor near the water, as if someone had dragged it there and left in a hurry. He called out once, even though he knew nobody was supposed to be inside. His voice came back flat from the concrete walls. Then he stepped closer and touched the bag with the tip of his boot. Something shifted inside. Yang froze. Then he crouched down, reached out with one hand and prodded the canvas again. This time the opening of the bag sagged loose, and something round rolled out into the beam of his flashlight. For 1 second, Yang's mind refused to name it. It looked like a dark, swollen shape with hair stuck to it. Then the face turned towards him. Yang stumbled backwards so fast he nearly fell. What had rolled out of that bag was a human head. It was badly decomposed, darkened by water and time, but it was still unmistakably a head. And suddenly every complaint from every customer in every restaurant made perfect sense in the worst possible way. The problem had never been the recipes, it had been the water. Yang scrambled out of the access door and climbed down the ladder with his hands shaking so badly he almost missed the rungs. When his feet hit the ground, he ran back down the hill and called police. Within a short time, officers arrived at the tower, and the area around it was sealed off. The restaurants below were told to stop using the water immediately. The first officers who went inside the tower did not stay calm for long. The bag contained more than just the head. It held the remains of a man who had been left in the water for days, maybe longer. And because that tower supplied the surrounding restaurants, the water had kept moving through pipes into kitchens, into pots and into meals, served to people who had no idea. For Lee and the other managers, the discovery was almost impossible to absorb. The customers had not been dramatic. The food had not merely tasted a little off. For nearly 2 full weeks, their restaurants had been cooking with water, contaminated by a decomposing body. Every bowl of soup, every pot of rice, every cup of tea had carried a trace of the secret sitting on that hill. The neighbourhood reacted the way any place would. People felt sick, even if they were not physically ill. They replayed recent meals in their minds and remembered the strange taste, the smell they had brushed aside the moment they pushed a bowl away and decided the chef must be having a bad day. Now they understood their bodies had noticed the truth before their minds could. Police began trying to identify the man in the tower. He was not from the immediate neighbourhood, which made the first hours difficult. There was no local family rushing forward to say he was missing. But investigators eventually learned he had come from another town, and that before he ended up in the water tower, he had crossed paths with a small organised crime group. The evidence suggested he had been robbed and killed somewhere else. After that, the killers needed a place to hide the body. Quickly, somewhere people would not casually look, somewhere high and locked and out of sight. A water tower may have seemed perfect to them. It was isolated enough to reach without being seen, but ordinary enough that nobody would think of it as a grave. And so one night police believed the killers carried the man's body up the hill in that canvas bag. They climbed or forced their way into the tower, dragged the bag inside, and left him there. Maybe they thought the water would hide the smell. Maybe they thought the building would stay closed for months. Maybe they never considered that the body would not just disappear, it would spread. That was the part that made the case feel so disturbing. The killers were trying to cover up one crime, but their hiding place turned the entire neighbourhood into witnesses. Not witnesses who saw a face or heard a scream, but witnesses who tasted something wrong and did not yet know what their senses were trying to tell them. Eventually, investigators found the 3 men connected to the robbery and murder. They were arrested, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The official ending was clean in the way court endings often are. Names were written down, punishments were handed out. The case was closed. But for the people who had eaten in those restaurants, the story did not end as neatly. Because there are some realizations you cannot wash out of a bowl. Lee could clean the kitchen, replace supplies, apologize to customers, and wait for business to come back. The water company could flush the system and inspect the tower again. But everybody who had been there still remembered that taste, and now they knew exactly where it had come from. The coldest part is that the first warning did not come from police, or a missing person report, or a witness who saw men carrying a canvas bag up a hill. It came from ordinary people sitting down to lunch and frowning at their food. One by one they put down their chopsticks and said something tasted wrong, and they were right long before they knew why. Water can hide a secret because it never stays still. It slips through pipes, disappears into steam, and leaves no shape behind when the bowl is empty. But in another village, the thing hiding the truth was not water, it was smoke ritual, and a man everyone trusted to see what others could not. On the evening of March 5th, 1958, in a small town in what is now Malaysia, a 22-year-old spiritual healer named Qasim bin Osman was sitting down for dinner when someone began pounding on his front door. The knocking was fast and uneven. It sounded less like a visitor and more like a person trying to get away from something. Kasim was not shocked that someone had come to him after dark. In town, people knew him as a bomo, a kind of traditional healer who was called when ordinary answers did not seem like enough. If a child had a fever, if a family believed bad luck had entered the house, or if someone felt cursed, they came to Kasim and asked him to help. Most of the time, Kasim did not mind it. He was young, but he had already built a reputation for being calm, serious, and gifted. People said he could read signs that other people missed. They said he knew how to clear sickness, settle spirits, and understand the hidden causes of trouble. So when the knocking came again, he wiped his hands and went to the door. When Kasim opened it, 4 men were standing on his porch. Their faces were tight with worry, and one of them stepped forward before the others could speak. He said his name was Corin, and he told Kasim that his wife had vanished the night before. He had searched all day, he said, and now he had nowhere else to go. Kasim looked past Corin at the other men. He recognized them vaguely from town, but none of them were close friends. They were not there for a fever, or a bad dream, or a blessing over a house. They were there because a woman was missing. And for the first time that evening, Kasim's face changed just a little. He told Corin he was sorry, but he had never found a missing person before. Healing was one thing. Looking into the dark for a living woman, or maybe a dead one, was something else. But Corin looked desperate, and the other men stared at Kasim like he was their last useful door. So after a moment, Kasim stepped aside and let them in. Inside the house, the men sat in a circle on the floor. The room was small and dim, with the kind of quiet that makes every movement sound louder than it should. Kasim went into a side room and came back carrying a bowl filled with charcoal and a box of matches. He set the bowl in the centre of the circle and told everyone not to speak. Then he struck a match. The flame caught flickered orange across his face and touched the charcoal. Smoke began to curl upward in thin grey threads. Kasim leaned over it, closed his eyes and started breathing deeply. The 4 men watched him inhale again and again until his shoulders loosened and his head began to sway. For several minutes nothing happened. The men sat in the smoke, shifting uneasily, listening to Kasim breathe. Then, just as it seemed like he might pass out, Kasim's eyes snapped open. He lifted his head from the bowl and said he had seen something. Not a face, not a house, a field. A flat light green field stretching out into the distance. Corin leaned forward and asked what that meant. Kasim did not answer right away. He looked disoriented, as if part of him was still inside whatever vision he claimed to have seen. Then he stood up and told them they needed to go. Not tomorrow, not after sunrise, now. And because they had come to him for exactly this, the men followed. About 15 minutes later, the group reached a rice field on the edge of town. Even in the darkness, the place had the pale green look Kasim had described. The men spread out and began searching, stepping carefully through the wet ground. At first, there was only the sound of insects' water and breath. Then one of the men shouted. Kasim and Corin hurried toward him. In the field, half hidden under a rough pile of straw, there was something large enough that everyone knew before anyone touched it. One man reached down and pulled the straw away. Underneath was Corin's wife. She was covered in blood and she was dead. For a few seconds nobody moved. Corin made a sound that was not quite a word and dropped to his knees beside her. The other men backed away, stunned by what they had found, and by the fact that Kasim had led them straight there. Kasim stood at the edge of the rice field, smoke still clinging faintly to his clothes, and watched the night change around him. About half an hour later, the police began taking control of the scene. The officer assigned to the case was named J.C. Sabui, and by the time he sat down with Corin at the station, he already knew the basic facts. A woman had gone missing. Her husband had gone to the local bomo. The bomo had performed a ritual, and somehow that ritual had led them to her body. Sabui did not know what to do with that last part. He was a police officer, not a man who built cases on visions. But he also could not ignore it because the woman really had been found exactly where Kasim had taken them. So for now, Sabui pushed the strange part aside and focused on the person sitting in front of him. Corin told him that the night before his wife had gone out for a walk and never returned. Sabui listened carefully, but that explanation did not sit well with him. A woman leaving alone at night and then turning up beaten to death in a rice field was not impossible. But it was convenient, and in murder cases, convenience always deserved a second look. Then Corin added another detail. His wife usually wore jewellery, he said. Bracelets, earrings, pieces people in town would notice. But when he found her body, the jewellery was gone. Sabui wrote that down. A robbery would make sense. It would explain why someone might attack her outdoors and leave her hidden under straw. Over the next 4 days, Sabui and his team worked the case in the ordinary way. They searched for the missing jewellery. They questioned people who knew Corin and his wife. They looked at the husband closely because that is where any investigation like this has to begin. But the more they worked, the less they had. They found no stolen jewellery in Corin's house, no witness who saw him with blood on him, no clear sign that he had lied about where he was. The robbery theory still made sense, but it had no suspect. The husband theory still made sense, but it had no evidence. And after 96 hours, Sabui was stuck in the kind of silence that makes a case feel like it is hardening around you. That was when someone suggested going back to Kasim. Sabui did not like the idea. He did not want to become the kind of officer who asked a healer to solve a murder. But he also had to admit one uncomfortable fact. Kasim had already found the body, and right now the police had found nothing. So on the morning of March 9th, Sabui walked to Kasim's house and knocked. Kasim answered the door looking cautious. Sabui explained that they still had not found the missing jewellery and that the case had stalled. He asked if Kasim would be willing to try again. Kasim hesitated and said, "I am not a policeman." Then he looked down as if already knowing that refusing would make him look strange after what had happened in the rice field. So Kasim agreed. He brought out the same kind of charcoal bowl, set it down and lit it again. Sabui watched closely this time. He watched Kasim lean over the smoke inhale until his eyes watered and sit there until his expression became loose and distant. A minute passed, then another. Finally, Kasim lifted his head and said he had seen where the jewellery was. Without explaining, Kasim stood and walked out into the road. Sabui followed. They moved through town one house at a time. At each place, Kasim stopped, stared at the walls or the front door, then moved on without saying anything. At first, Sabui felt a small spark of hope. After an hour, that hope began to thin. The whole thing started to feel foolish. Kasim would stand in front of a house, breathe slowly, look serious, and then keep walking. People came to their windows. Children stared from doorways. Sabui could feel the town watching him follow a young healer through the streets while a murder case waited for real evidence. Then, without warning, Kasim stopped. He stood in front of one house longer than he had stood anywhere else. He stared at it as though listening to something inside the walls. Sabui came up beside him and waited. After several seconds, Kasim turned and said, "The jewellery is here." Sabui looked at the house. At first he felt intrigued because this was not one of the places he had expected. It was not the husband's home. It was not the home of a known thief. It was not a house connected to any witness in a way that made obvious sense. So Sabui called for backup because if Kasim was right again, they needed to handle it properly. When the officers arrived, they searched the house. They opened drawers, lifted mats, checked containers, and moved carefully through each room. Then one of them called out. Hidden inside the house, they had found the dead woman's jewellery. Bracelets, earrings, the missing pieces Corin had described. Kasim had done it again. For 1 second it looked impossible, in the same way the rice field had looked impossible. A young Bomo had breathed smoke, walked through town, and found what trained officers could not find. But then Sabui stood very still and looked around the room. Because the house where the jewellery had been found was Kasim's own house, the meaning of everything changed at once. The first vision no longer looked like a miracle. The second vision no longer looked like a gift. Together they looked like knowledge. Kasim knew where the body was because he had put it there. He knew where the jewellery was because he had hidden it. And the ritual smoke had not opened a door to the unseen. It had covered the door in plain sight. Kasim was taken into custody, and the town that had trusted him began to understand what had happened. The woman really had gone out walking the night she disappeared. At some point she passed near Kasim's house, and there the man people came to for healing, attacked her, killed her, and stole the jewellery she was wearing. Afterward, Kasim moved her body to the rice field and covered it with straw. He hid the jewellery inside his own home. Maybe he thought the husband would be blamed. Maybe he thought the missing jewellery would make everyone believe in a robbery by some stranger. But when Corin came to his door asking for help, Kasim made a different calculation. He decided that if he helped find the body, he would look innocent. More than innocent, really. He would look powerful. He would look like the one man in town who could see through darkness. And for a while it worked. The men in the rice field believed. The town believed. Even Sabui, who did not want to believe, had been forced to wonder. But Kasim made one mistake. He believed the same performance could save him twice. The first time he led people to a place he already knew, it made him look gifted. The second time, he led police to the one place he should have kept them from looking. His own house, his own hiding place, his own proof. His own... After his arrest, Qasim confessed. The story became brutally simple, after all the smoke and ritual were stripped away. There had been no spirit guiding him, no hidden energy pointing toward a field, no supernatural vision pulling him through town. There was only a killer who thought pretending to solve the murder would make him too useful to suspect. Qasim was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. For the people in that town, the legal ending may have answered the case, but it did not undo the damage of trust. Because many of them had invited him into their homes. They had brought him sick children, family fears, grief, bad luck, and private pain. They had believed his hands were there to heal. And maybe that is why this story stays cold. Not because a man lied. People lie all the time. It stays cold because he used the shape of comfort as camouflage. He lit the charcoal breathed in the smoke, lowered his voice, and let everyone believe they were watching a gift. But all they were watching was guilt trying to look holy. In the end, the clearest image is not the rice field, or even the jewellery hidden in the house. It is that bowl of charcoal burning low on the floor while police stood in the doorway. The smoke rose the same way it had before, soft and grey and harmless looking. Only this time everyone could see where it had really been leading. A ritual can make people believe the dead are finally being heard. It can make grief feel less helpless, at least for a moment. But sometimes a living use ritual to hide what they have done. And sometimes in a crowded funeral room, someone in pain decides to use a ritual for the opposite reason, to send the dead looking for revenge. At 8 in the morning on August 22nd, 1974, inside a public mortuary in Hong Kong, a young man named Leo Fun sat on a wooden bench and stared at the open coffin at the front of the room. His older sister Fumin was inside it. Around him his relatives sat in silence, but the room did not feel private. Reporters had crowded into the mortuary before the family could even settle. They whispered near the walls, scribbled in notebooks, and leaned in for photographs like they were documenting an exhibit instead of a funeral. Leo watched one of them lift a camera toward the coffin, and something hot moved through his chest. His sister had become a headline before she had even been buried. 1 week earlier, Fumin had been found dead in a hotel room in Hong Kong. She was 34 years old, and at first the case looked like a brutal but ordinary murder. She had been strangled. She had been left behind by whoever killed her, but when police and reporters learned what had happened to her face, the whole city seemed to lean closer. Her killer had cut away parts of her face. Her eyebrows were gone. Her eyelids were gone. Her nose and lips were gone too. The newspapers described it in a way that made Leo sick, because they wrote about her like the point of her life was the condition of her body after death. They did not write enough about the person she had been before that room. Now in the coffin, the damage was impossible to hide. Without eyelids, Fumin's eyes looked wide open, fixed on the ceiling with a glassy stare. Without lips, her teeth showed in a terrible frozen expression that people kept calling a smile, even though nobody in her family could bear that word. Leo kept looking down at his own hands so he would not have to look too long. His family had tried to keep the service quiet. They wanted prayers, incense, lowered voices, and a last moment with Fumin that belonged only to them. But the reporters had turned the room into something else. Leo could hear camera shutters clicking between the murmurs. Every sound felt like another insult, another hand reaching toward his sister without permission, and the police had not arrested anyone. That was the part Leo could not put down. The funeral had arrived faster than justice. His sister's body was right there, damaged in a way no person should be, while the man who had done it was somewhere outside the mortuary, breathing, eating, sleeping, maybe even reading the papers, and enjoying the fear he had created. Leo had barely slept since the murder. He had listened to relatives whisper about suspects, rumours, old grudges, and men Fumin might have known. None of it turned into anything real. Every theory faded as soon as it was spoken. So by the morning of the funeral, grief had hardened into a simple thought in Leo's mind. If the living could not find her killer, maybe the dead could. During the service, Leo sat very still. He bowed when the family bowed. He answered when someone spoke softly to him. But inside his jacket, pressed flat against his side, there was a large knife. He had brought it into the mortuary without telling anyone, and every few minutes his fingers brushed the handle through the fabric. Leo was not planning to hurt a reporter, although part of him wanted to scare them away. He was not planning to hurt a police officer either. The knife was for something older and stranger than that. He had heard of a Taoist ritual that, if performed at the coffin, could release a murdered person's spirit and send it toward the one who had done the killing. Maybe Leo believed it completely. Maybe he only needed to believe it for one morning because the alternative was unbearable. Either way, as the prayers ended and relatives began stepping forward to say goodbye, Leo stood with them. He moved slowly toward the coffin, his face blank, his hands sliding inside his jacket. People around him were focused on Fumin. That gave Leo just enough time. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the knife, and in one quick movement, raised it over the coffin. A few people gasped and stepped back, thinking for a second that Leo had snapped. But Leo did not turn toward the crowd. He drove the blade down into the wood. The sound cracked through the mortuary. The reporters froze. Family members cried out. The knife stuck in the coffin, trembling slightly from the force of the strike. Leo leaned over it, breathing hard, eyes locked on his sister's face. To him, this was not violence against Fumin. It was a door being opened. No one seemed to know what to do right away. A relative grabbed Leo by the arm and pulled him back. Someone shouted at him to stop. One of the reporters stumbled over a bench trying to get a better view. But Leo had already done what he came to do. In his mind, his sister had been given a path out of the coffin, and now the killer would have to feel her looking for him. The rest of the funeral passed in a strange, shaken quiet. People still cried, but now they kept glancing at the knife mark in the coffin. Even the reporters seemed less eager for noise, as if the room had tilted into a place they did not fully understand. Eventually, Fumin's body was taken away for burial, and the family stepped out into the humid Hong Kong morning. By the next evening, the city had moved on in the way cities always do. Shops stayed open. Buses rolled through traffic. People argued over dinner and money and work. But not far from the mortuary, a policewoman walking her nighttime patrol glanced down an alley and saw a man lying on the ground in a twisted heap. At first she thought he was dead. His limbs were bent at wrong angles and blood darkened his clothes. He looked like he had fallen from a great height and hit the pavement hard. The policewoman called for an ambulance, then knelt beside him and saw incredibly that his eyes were open. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. She asked him what happened. The man's face tightened with pain, and for a moment all he could do was look upward at the building beside them. Then he whispered that a woman had pushed him. The officer looked up too. There was a rooftop high above the alley, dark against the night sky, so more officers were sent up to search it. They found nothing. No woman, no signs of a struggle, no dropped purse, no torn clothing, no footprint that explained a fight on the roof. The upper floors were quiet. The stairwell was empty. If a woman had pushed him and run, she had vanished in a way that made no sense. So the injured man was taken to the hospital, and the police waited for him to become stable enough to talk. When officers came to interview him again, they expected confusion. They thought maybe he had been drunk or hallucinating or trying to hide a suicide attempt. They asked him to describe the woman who pushed him. The man stared at them from his hospital bed, his face pale and swollen, and began describing someone no officer in the room expected. He said the woman had huge glassy eyes. He said she had no eyebrows, no eyelids, no nose, no lips. He said her mouth looked like a horrible toothy grin, and when she came toward him, he knew exactly who she was. The officers went quiet because the description was not vague. It matched the murdered woman in the coffin. It matched Fumin. Of course that was impossible. Fumin was dead before this man went off the roof. Her body had been in a coffin the morning before. Her family had watched her funeral. There was no version of ordinary life where she could climb to a rooftop and push a man into an alley. But the officers also knew something else. A terrified man in great pain had just described a dead woman's mutilated face with horrifying accuracy. So they pressed him harder. They asked how he knew Fumin. They asked why he would say her name. They asked what really happened in that hotel room. And little by little, the story began to open. The man on the hospital bed was not a random victim of a rooftop attack. He was connected to the murder everyone was talking about. He eventually confessed. He said he had wanted to marry Fumin and she had rejected him. That rejection in his mind became humiliation. Humiliation became rage. And rage became the kind of violence that does not stop when the victim stops breathing. He strangled her in the hotel room, then damaged her face in a final act of control and punishment. The confession gave police what they had been missing. Suddenly the man in the alley was not just a patient with a strange story. He was the killer Leo had wanted found. The police did not have to prove that Fumin's spirit had pushed him. They only had to prove he killed her, and now he had given them the words they needed to begin doing that. Still, the timing made people whisper. The funeral happened. Leo stabbed the coffin. The ritual was supposed to release Fumin's spirit to search for her killer. Then the very next night, a man fell from a roof, claimed a faceless woman had pushed him, and confessed to killing the faceless woman whose coffin had just been struck open. To the police, maybe it was fear. Maybe the killer had attended the funeral from a distance or read about it and spiraled. Maybe guilt gave shape to the face he had tried to erase. Maybe he went to the roof in a panic, saw something his own mind created and fell. But to Leo and many people who heard the story, those explanations did not feel strong enough. The courts would handle the case in the language of human law. The man was arrested. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. On paper, that was the ending. A rejected proposal, a murder, a confession, a sentence. But the paper version could not fully hold the part everyone remembered. People remembered the mortuary. They remembered the reporters, the open coffin, the family trying not to look at Fumin's face for too long. They remembered Leo standing up with the knife. They remembered the sound of metal biting into wood. And then they remembered the man in the alley looking up at the rooftop and saying a woman had pushed him. For Leo, none of it brought his sister back. It did not erase the photographs or the headlines. It did not return dignity to the room where strangers had stared at her body. But it gave him one thing the morning of the funeral had not given him. It gave him the name of the man who had done it and the knowledge that the killer had been afraid. And maybe that is why the story still feels so cold. It does not ask you to decide exactly what happened on that roof. It only gives you the sequence. A sister was murdered and left without a face. Her brother struck her coffin with a knife. Then the man who killed her fell into an alley and described the dead woman as the last thing he saw. The image that stays is not the fall. It is the coffin, the room full of reporters, the family frozen in shock, Leo's hand on the knife, the blade standing upright in the wood like a marker, or a warning, or a promise made in front of the dead. And somewhere outside that room, a killer still thought he had gotten away. There are places where fear starts with a ritual, a blade, and the belief that the dead may not be finished with the living. But other times there is no coffin and no prayer at all. There is only fog sliding over a military hillside, a tired Marine stepping away from safety, and something with blue eyes standing perfectly still in the dark. On a Saturday night at Camp Horno on the western side of Camp Pendleton in Southern California, a young Marine stood at the edge of a patrol base and looked out into the fog. He had already spent the entire day moving over steep hills, loose rock and brush that grabbed at his legs. His body hurt, his eyes burned, and now he was about to do something he knew was probably stupid. The Marine was with Golf Company, and earlier that day, his platoon had been moving across a section of high ground called the Alpha Shelf. If you have never trained, then just imagine a strip of ugly hillside that looks simple from a distance, then punishes you the second you step onto it. The trails are steep, the ground breaks loose under your boots, and at night the fog comes in low and thick. They had been moving between evaluation stations all day, doing the usual field exercise routine, patrol security movement radio calls, waiting more movement, more waiting. By the time night fell, everybody was tired in that specific military way, where you are not sleepy exactly. You are just running on whatever part of your body has not quit yet. That night, his squad was told to recon an enemy position on the far side of the shelf. They put on their night optics, checked their gear, and stepped off into the dark. Almost immediately, the route turned bad. The lights from the School of Infantry in the distance were bleeding into their night vision, and every dip in the terrain looked flatter than it really was. The squad climbed a narrow section of shelf where the ground dropped away, in places you could not see until you were already on top of them. At one point, the Marine lost his footing and fell straight into a crevasse. He dropped several feet, hit something hard-rolled and landed at the bottom, with the air knocked out of him. For a few seconds, all he could do was lie there and listen to himself breathe. One of his buddies had to lower a rifle down to him so he could grab it and get pulled out. Nobody had time to make a big deal out of it because everyone was slipping, stumbling and trying not to become the next person to fall. So the Marine climbed back up, shook it off as best he could, and kept moving with the squad. Eventually they finished the mission and made it back to the patrol base. It had taken about an hour, and by then the Marine was sore everywhere. His knees hurt, his shoulders hurt, and the spot where he had landed in the crevasse was starting to throb. All he wanted was to get into his bivvy, pull his whoobie around him and disappear for a few hours. But as the squad settled in and Firewatch was posted, he reached down and felt one of his cargo pockets. Then he froze. His 40-round PMag was gone. Now, to anybody outside that world, this sounds ridiculous. It was just a magazine. But to a young Marine, especially one who had a good piece of gear that was not easy to replace, losing it felt personal. He patted every pocket again, slower this time, hoping he had just missed it. Nothing. Then he replayed the route in his head and knew exactly where it had probably fallen out. The crevasse. When he had hit the ground and rolled around in the dark, the PMag must have slipped loose. And now it was out there, somewhere on the Alpha shelf. He turned to his buddy and said he was going back for it. His buddy looked at him like he had just suggested walking into the ocean with his rifle over his head. Then he said, "You are not going to find that mag." He paused for a second, looked out into the fog, and added, "But I am not going to stop you. Good luck." That should have been enough to make him stay. He was tired. He was alone. He would be moving through rough terrain in the dark outside the patrol base, with fog rolling in, and no good reason beyond stubbornness. But here is the thing. Small bad decisions almost never feel dramatic while you are making them. They feel practical. They feel like you can handle them. So he grabbed his rifle, adjusted his night optics, and slipped out the back of the patrol base. He told himself he would move fast, retrace the route, find the crevasse, grab the PMag, and be back before anyone really noticed. It was not a mission. It was just a quick walk. That is what he told himself as the fog swallowed the lights behind him. For the first few minutes, everything was normal enough. His boots crunched softly over the ground. His breathing sounded too loud inside his own head. Through the green glow of the night optics, the hillside looked flat and strange, like a bad copy of itself. He moved slowly, trying to match the route the squad had taken earlier. Then he stopped. About 10 feet away, 2 deer were standing in the brush. They were not running. They were just looking at him. Under the night optics, their bodies were pale and ghost-like, and their eyes held the light in a way that made them seem too aware. He stared at them, and they stared back. Nobody moved. After maybe 20 seconds, both deer suddenly bolted up a nearby hill. The Marine let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He almost laughed because that was the obvious answer. Wildlife. Fog. Exhaustion. Your brain takes a deer and turns it into a threat because you are alone and tired and walking where you should not be. So he kept going. But the feeling did not leave. In fact, a few minutes later it got worse. It started as that little pressure at the back of the neck, the kind you feel, before you turn around and find someone looking at you. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was because the deer had spooked him, but then the feeling sharpened. He slowly turned his head. About 50 meters behind him, standing in the fog, there was a dark figure. It was not moving. It was not crouched like an animal, or shaped quite like a Marine. It looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. Too rounded in places, too hazy around the edges, like the fog was gathering around it, instead of passing through. Then he saw the eyes. They were blue. Not reflective white, not the bright flash of an animal caught in light, but a cold blue glow set into the shape where a face should have been. The figure stood perfectly still, looking directly at him. For about 5 seconds, the Marine could not move. His rifle was in his hands, but it did not feel useful. Then fear finally reached his legs. He turned and ran. He ran hard through the fog, not quietly, not tactically, not like someone worried about noise discipline. He just moved. His boots hit rocks, brush slapped his knees, and at one point he tripped and hit the ground so hard that pain flashed through his whole body, but he scrambled up and kept going. After a while, he forced himself to stop and breathe. He had run uphill and sideways and had no idea if he was still on the route he meant to follow. The fog was thicker now, and the lights from the infantry school glowed in the distance like something underwater. He used those lights as a landmark and tried to rebuild the map in his head. Slowly, the panic dropped just enough for his original mission to come back. The PMag. He had come out here for the PMag. And because fear and stubbornness can exist in the same body, he kept moving toward the section of ground where he believed he had fallen earlier. A smarter person might have gone back, but he was already out there, and he was close. After a few more minutes, he found the crevasse. It was right where he thought it would be, a dark break in the ground that looked even worse now that he was alone. He climbed down carefully, one boot at a time, using his free hand against the rock, and there, lying near the bottom like it had been waiting for him, was his 40-round PMag. For half a second he felt ridiculous relief. All of this for one magazine. All this fear. All this running, all this pain, and there it was, a piece of gear in the dirt. He reached down and picked it up. And the second his fingers closed around it, something cold moved across the back of his neck. It was not the normal chill of coastal fog. He knew that kind of cold. This felt focused, like a breath pushed out inches behind him. His shoulders locked. He did not turn around right away because some part of him was afraid that if he looked, he would see blue eyes staring down into the crevasse. So he climbed out as fast as he could. Once he reached the top, he ran again. But by now he was disoriented. He cut through brush, came out near the company command post by mistake, ducked away before anyone could challenge him, then followed a higher trail he thought would lead back toward his patrol base. A vehicle came through with headlights and he dropped behind a bush until it passed. Then he pushed through more brush and suddenly popped out in front of another squad, moving in a night patrol column. They were just as startled as he was. For one awkward second, everyone froze rifles and night optics, and confused faces pointed at each other. Then the Marine turned around and ran back into the brush without explaining anything. At this point he was not thinking clearly. He was thinking in short pieces. Find the patrol base. Stay out of sight. Do not look too long into the fog. He moved downhill until he recognized the place where he had first seen the 2 deer. That gave him one small point of certainty. He knew this spot. He knew which direction should take him home. Before he moved on, he looked toward the area where the figure had appeared the first time. Nothing was there. Just fog brush, and the dim glow of distant lights. For 1 second he felt his mind reach for the reasonable explanation again. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe the blue eyes were some weird effect from the optics. Maybe he had scared himself. Then he turned toward the direction of the patrol base. And there it was again. The same dark figure stood in the fog ahead of him, motionless with the same blue eyes fixed on him. It was not where he had seen it before. It was not behind him now. It was between him and where he needed to go, as if it had simply waited until he turned around. This time he did not freeze. He ran. He ran like the ground behind him was opening up. He ran through brush over loose rock and across the uneven trail without caring what he hit or how loud he was. The fog made everything feel close and blind, but he kept moving toward where he believed the patrol base had to be. Finally, he crashed through the edge of the patrol base and found his buddy. He was breathing hard, dirty sore, and probably looked like he had just crawled out of a hole, which in a way, he had. His buddy stared at him and asked what happened. The Marine held up the recovered PMag first because that was easier than saying the rest. Then he told him. He told him about the deer, the fog, the figure, the blue eyes, the cold on his neck, and seeing it again on the way back. His buddy listened, and maybe part of him wanted to laugh, but the Marine did not look like someone telling a funny field story. He looked like someone who had been watched from the dark and had barely made it back. After that, the Marine crawled into his bivvy sack and pulled his whoopee around him, but sleep did not come right away. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure standing in the fog, not chasing, not yelling, not doing anything that made sense as a threat, just standing there still enough to make the stillness feel intentional. Later, he tried to explain it away. He thought about the night optics, the fog, the deer, the lack of sleep, and the fall into the crevasse. All of those things could twist perception. Marines spend enough time exhausted in strange terrain that the mind can absolutely fill in gaps. He knew that. He wanted that to be the answer. But the problem was the second sighting. It was one thing to mistake an animal for a figure behind you. It was another thing to see the same shape again in a different direction, with the same blue eyes after you had already moved through half the hillside, trying to get away from it. That detail did not sit neatly inside any normal explanation. And that is the part of Camp Horno stories that tends to stay with people. The place is already miserable enough without adding anything supernatural. The hills are steep. The fog is real. The brush is real. The fatigue is real. But every now and then someone comes back with a story that does not sound like a ghost story at first. It sounds like a bad decision. A Marine leaves the patrol base alone. He loses his route. He chases a piece of gear he should have abandoned until morning. And somewhere in that chain of ordinary choices, the world tilts just slightly. A deer does not run when it should. A patch of fog has a shape. A pair of blue eyes appears where no person should be standing. He did get the PMag back. That is the strange, almost stupid punchline to the whole night. He went out for a magazine, found it, and returned with it in his hand. But he also came back with the feeling that something on that hillside had noticed him. Not because he was special, not because he was looking for it, but because he had stepped away from the group at the wrong hour. The image that stays is not the run back. It is the moment at the crevasse when his fingers closed around the thing he had come to find, and that cold breath crossed the back of his neck. For a second he had exactly what he wanted, and then he understood that he might not have been alone down there after all. Fog can make a hillside feel endless, but sound can make it feel occupied. One shape standing still in the dark is bad enough. A voice is worse because a voice asks you to imagine a mouth, a body, and a reason for being there. And on another night at Camp Horno, 2 Marines sitting firewatch would not see blue eyes in the fog. They would hear a little girl laughing from the trees. At 2 a.m, in a mock village tucked into one of the valleys around Camp Horno, 2 Marines sat behind a machine gun and stared at a dark tree line about 10 feet away. The place was supposed to be fake. The buildings were just metal containers. The streets were gravel, and the whole town existed, so Marines could practice fighting in places that looked like real neighborhoods. But at night that fake town did not feel fake. It felt abandoned. The training lanes were quiet, the hills around them were black, and the ocean fog had started sliding inland, folding itself between the containers and the trees. The Marine on the gun could barely see past the road in front of him. His buddy sat close enough that they could talk without raising their voices. They were on the 2 to 4 firewatch, which everybody hated because it broke the night in the worst possible place. You were tired before it started and useless when it ended. Their post faced a long strip of gravel road. To their right was the edge of the MOUT town. To their left was thick brush and trees that looked like a solid wall in the dark. For the first part of the watch, nothing happened. They talked quietly, checked the road, shifted their weight, and tried not to think about how slowly time was moving. Somewhere behind them, other Marines were asleep in their gear or pretending to sleep. The whole valley had that low, damp silence that comes right before fog gets heavy enough to swallow distance. Then they heard movement in the trees. It was not loud, just a rustle at first, like something stepping through leaves and dry branches. The Marine on the gun turned his head toward it, and his buddy did the same. For a few seconds they listened. The sound stopped. Then it started again, a little closer, or maybe just clearer. His buddy whispered, "You hear that?" The Marine nodded. At first neither of them was scared. Camp Pendleton had plenty of animals, and at night animals always sounded bigger than they were. It could have been deer, it could have been a coyote. It could have been some dumb raccoon digging around the edge of the training area like it owned the place. Still, the sound was annoying and it was close, so his buddy picked up a rock from the ground, cocked his arm back, and threw it into the brush. The rock cracked through branches and landed somewhere in the darkness. The rustling stopped immediately. The 2 Marines looked at each other with a small, satisfied look of people who think they solved something. For a few minutes the tree line stayed quiet. The Marine on the gun looked back down the road, trying to keep his eyes moving the way he was supposed to. But now, because he had noticed the brush once, he could not stop noticing it. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every patch of fog behind the trees looked like it had weight to it. Then the rustling started again. This time it was not a single movement. It sounded like footsteps moving back and forth behind the first row of trees. Not heavy, not running, just pacing. The Marine leaned forward and tried to see through the dark, but the fog had thickened, and the trees were turning into one flat shape. His buddy said, "Maybe it's up 4. That was the most comforting explanation. Maybe another group was out there playing enemy force, waiting to test them, or sneak up on the post. But that did not really fit. If it was up 4, they were doing a terrible job. They were too close, too noisy, and not making contact the way a training scenario usually would. The Marine reached for the radio, then stopped. He did not want to call up something stupid. Nobody wants to be the guy who wakes up the chain of command because a raccoon stepped on a branch. So they waited. The sound faded again. The fog pressed in. For another minute, the only thing they heard was their own breathing. Then a voice came from the trees. It was small and high, and for 1 second, the Marine thought his brain had made it out of the wind. But then it came again. A little girl's voice somewhere in the brush to their left, speaking words he could not quite understand. Both Marines went completely still. There was no reason for a child to be there. Not at Camp Horno. Not in a training valley. Not at 2 in the morning beside a MOUT town full of tired Marines and blank fire weapons and machine gun posts. The Marine looked at his buddy, and the expression on his face said he had heard it too. That was the first truly bad moment. The voice stopped talking. Then it started laughing. It was a child's giggle, light and quick, the kind of sound that would have meant nothing in a backyard or a school hallway. Out there, coming from the trees, it felt wrong in a way neither Marine could shape into words. It rose, paused and started again as if whoever was out there knew they were listening. The Marine grabbed the radio. His mouth felt dry as he called up to the corporal of the guard and reported that they were hearing voices in the tree line. There was a pause on the radio. Then the corporal asked him to say again. The Marine looked into the trees, heard the giggle again and said, "It sounds like a little girl." That got passed up to the sergeant of the guard, who clearly wanted nothing to do with it. The answer came back in the kind of tone people use when they are pretending something is not weird, because they are not physically standing near it. The sergeant told the corporal to go down to their post and sit with them for a bit. A few minutes later, the corporal walked up, trying to look annoyed instead of nervous. He asked what they had heard. They told him about the rustling, the footsteps, the voice and the laugh. For the first few minutes after he arrived, nothing happened. The woods were silent, and that almost made the two Marines feel worse because now they looked like they had let the dark get into their heads. The corporal shifted his weight and stared into the trees. He was just about to say something when the giggle started again. This time all three of them heard it clearly. It came from the brush, just beyond the post, soft and childish and completely out of place. The corporal did not joke. He did not roll his eyes. He just slowly reached for his radio. He called the lieutenant and asked if any other units were operating in the area. The reply came back that no one else was supposed to be near them. No role players. No other platoon moving through the tree line. No training event involving a child's voice in the woods, which was not exactly something anyone should have needed to clarify. Then the static started. The radio hissed and crackled in a way that seemed to rise every time the laughter came back. The Marine on the gun watched the tree line, waiting for a shape to step out. A person, a Marine, an animal, anything. But there was only fog and brush and that little voice moving somewhere behind it. The corporal reported what he had heard. The answer that came back was not helpful. They were told to ignore it and finish the watch. And in a strange way, that was the most military answer possible. There was no category for what they were hearing, no procedure that fit it cleanly, and no one wanted to send people into the woods over a disembodied laugh. So the three of them sat there. The machine gun pointed down the road. The fake town sat silent behind them. The tree line breathed fog in front of them. For the next hour, they heard footsteps moving in the brush, sometimes slow and sometimes quick, like someone small was running from one tree to another and stopping just before they could be seen. Every now and then, the little girl laughed again. Not constantly. That might have been easier because then it would become background noise. Instead, it came in bursts, always after just enough silence for them to start hoping it was over. A giggle in the dark, then footsteps, then static, then nothing. Then none of them moved toward the trees. Later, maybe someone could call that cowardly, but sitting there in the moment, it felt like the only sane choice. They had rifles, they had a radio, they had rank structure. But none of those things made sense against a child's laugh coming from a place where no child could be. The Marine tried to keep his attention on the road, but his eyes kept dragging left. Each time the brush moved, he expected to see a small face between branches. He imagined pale hands gripping the tree trunks. He imagined a little girl standing there in the fog, smiling at them like this was all a game. And he hated that his mind kept giving the voice a body. The corporal stayed with them for the rest of the watch. Nobody talked much. Every time one of them started to say something normal, the trees made another sound and killed the conversation. The Marine remembered thinking that if this had been an animal, it should have moved away by now. If it had been a person, they should have been found. If it had been a prank, someone would have laughed like an idiot and come out. But nothing came out. The voice stayed hidden. The footsteps stayed just inside the tree line. The fog grew darker in places, or maybe their eyes were getting tired from staring into it too long. The fake buildings behind them began to feel less like cover, and more like empty shells, as if the whole MOUT town had been built around that patch of woods. Finally, near 4 in the morning, their relief arrived. Another pair of Marines came down the road, tired and half awake, ready to take the post. And the second they got close, everything stopped. The static faded. The footsteps stopped moving. The little girl did not laugh again. The tree line became just a tree line. The Marine on the gun did not wait around to explain every detail. He and his buddy handed over the post as fast as they could and got out of there. The corporal left too, and nobody made a big speech about what had happened. There was nothing to say that would not sound ridiculous in daylight. A little girl laughed at us from the woods. We called it up. They told us to ignore her. Later, the Marine tried to think through normal explanations. Maybe sound carried from somewhere else. Maybe another unit was farther away than command realised. Maybe an animal made a noise that only sounded like laughter because they were tired. But those answers never covered all of it. Not the footsteps, not the voice, not the corporal hearing it too. And they definitely did not explain why it stopped the moment relief showed up. That detail bothered him most. It made the whole thing feel aware, like whatever had been in the trees was not just making noise, it was choosing an audience. It had waited with them through the worst part of the night, and when the watch changed, it was finished. Camp Horno is full of explanations for strange things. Fog moves wrong. Hills throw sound. Animals get close. Exhausted Marines see patterns where there are none. Most stories can be folded into one of those boxes if you push hard enough. But sometimes a story has one detail that does not fold. In this one, it was the laugh. Because a laugh is not just a sound. It means someone is amused. It means someone understands that you are scared or confused or listening. That is what made it feel so much worse than rustling in the brush. The trees were not just making noise at them. Something in those trees sounded like it was enjoying the fact that they could not leave. By morning, the MOUT town probably looked ugly and ordinary again. Containers, gravel, dry brush, spent brass Marines packing gear, and acting like nothing strange had happened. But for the men on that watch, the place had changed. They had sat in a fake town, built for pretend combat, and heard something that did not belong to any training schedule. The image that stays is simple. 3 Marines sitting behind a gun, staring at trees 10 feet away, while fog crawls over the gravel road. The radio hisses, the brush moves, and from somewhere just beyond the reach of their lights, a little girl laughs softly, like she's been standing there the whole time. A fake town can feel safe once the sun comes up, because daylight turns monsters back into shipping containers and tree lines back into brush. But the barracks are different. They are lit. They have doors, stairs, duty logs, and people sleeping behind thin walls. And that almost makes it worse when someone appears in a hallway where they could not possibly have arrived. At around 2 in the morning on a Saturday, at Camp Horno, a Marine standing duty in building 53570 stepped out of the duty hut and began his rove through the barracks. The halls were mostly quiet. A few rooms had low music behind closed doors. Somewhere upstairs a toilet flushed and then the building went still again. He had done this routine enough times that his body almost moved by itself. Walk the deck, check the stairwells, make sure nobody was passed out where they should not be. Make sure no drunk Marine had decided the catwalk was a good place to start a fight. Most nights' duty was not scary. It was boring, and boredom was usually the real enemy. Building 53570 sat near the chow hall, one of those military buildings with a number nobody remembered fondly, and a layout that only made sense after you had been lost in it twice. The barracks had long exterior walkways, bright hallway lights, stairwells at the ends, and windows that reflected your own shape back at you when you passed them at night. That night, the Marine was making his way along the second deck when something in the parking lot caught his attention. He looked down and saw a woman standing below, alone between the parked cars. She appeared to be Asian, with dark hair, and she was looking straight up at him. Not toward the building, not around the lot, directly at him. At first he did not think much of it. Marines had girlfriends, people visited. Sometimes family members or friends showed up at odd hours because military schedules are strange, and young people make bad decisions. So he looked at her for a second, decided it was not his problem, and continued his rove along the deck. But as he walked, the image stayed with him. The woman had not waved. She had not called up to anyone. She had just stood there still enough that he wondered if she was waiting for someone who was not coming down. He told himself not to get wrapped up in it. Not my monkeys, not my circus. That was the phrase that went through his head. A few minutes later, he stepped back inside the building and started toward the duty hut. The hallway was long and lit in that washed-out barracks way, where every door looked the same and the floor seemed to stretch farther than it should. He had taken only a few steps when he stopped so suddenly his boots squeaked on the floor. At the far end of the second deck hallway stood the same woman from the parking lot. She was facing him. Her posture was the same. Her head was angled the same way. And even from that distance, he had the sickening sense that she was looking directly into his eyes, just like she had been doing from the pavement below. For a second, his mind tried to fix it. Maybe she had taken the stairs fast. Maybe there was another entrance. Maybe he had seen a different woman who looked similar. But none of that worked. He had gone inside almost immediately after seeing her below, and there was no way she had crossed the lot. Entered the building, climbed to the second deck, and reached the far hallway before him. The woman did not move. She did not ask for help. She did not say she was looking for someone. She just stood at the end of the hall like she had been placed there. The Marine felt the air leave his chest, and whatever professionalism duty was supposed to require started to lose its argument. He backed away one step, then another. Then he turned and moved fast for the stairs. He did not sprint at first because part of him still wanted to pretend he was not scared. But by the time he reached the stairwell, he was taking the steps two at a time. He went up to the fourth deck, where the assistant officer of the day was hanging out in the lounge. The assistant officer was awake, sitting under fluorescent lights, probably trying to get through the night with as little drama as possible. When the Marine came in looking rattled, he looked up and asked what was going on. The Marine told him about the woman in the parking lot, and then the woman in the hallway. He could hear how ridiculous it sounded as he said it. Before the assistant officer could answer, both of them heard footsteps outside the lounge door. Not slow footsteps, running footsteps. They crossed the catwalk just beyond the room, quick and sharp, like someone was sprinting past. Both Marines went silent. Then they stood up and went to the door. They opened it and stepped out onto the fourth deck. No one was there. The walkway stretched empty in both directions. No door was closing. No figure was turning a corner. No footsteps were fading down the stairs. But the sound continued for a moment longer, running along the catwalk, even though the catwalk was visibly empty. The assistant officer let out a long breath and rubbed his face like someone had just handed him a problem he wanted absolutely no part of. He looked at the Marine and said something like, "Why are you bringing this into my life?" It was half a joke, but only half. His voice had changed. He had heard it too. Then he told the Marine to go back to his post and finish the night. That was the practical answer. It was also the answer the Marine wanted least. He looked toward the stairwell, thought about the woman at the end of the hallway, thought about the footsteps outside a room where no feet had been, and told the assistant officer he was not going back out there alone. Normally that might have turned into an argument. Duty was duty. Roving was part of the job. But the assistant officer had just heard the running too, and that made the whole thing harder to dismiss. So instead of pushing it, he let the Marines stay in the lounge. The two of them decided without really saying it that they would wait out the rest of the night together. For a while they talked about anything except what had just happened. Sports, movies, people in the unit. Dumb things they had seen Marines do. They kept their voices low, but not too low because silence would have made the room feel bigger. Every so often one of them glanced toward the lounge window that looked out into the hall. Nothing was there. The building made its normal nighttime sounds. A door clicked somewhere below. Pipes shifted in the walls. Air moved through vents. Each sound made them pause, then pretend they had not paused. And with every quiet minute, the Marine felt the reasonable explanation trying to return. Maybe they had both misheard. Maybe the woman had just been a visitor. But the hallway image kept coming back. He could still see her standing at the far end, not blurred, not half seen, not something glimpsed from the corner of his eye. She had been there. And the more he replayed it, the less it felt like she had followed him from the parking lot. It felt like she had been waiting for him to look away. Around 4 a.m, the lounge had gone quiet again. The Marine was sitting with his body turned slightly toward the window. The assistant officer was nearby, tired, but still awake. The night was getting close to that strange hour before dawn, when everything feels thinner, as if the building is waiting for the sun before it decides to be normal. The Marine glanced at the lounge window. Then his whole body went cold. On the other side of the glass in the hallway, the woman was standing there. She was close now, close enough that there was no mistaking her. Her face was turned toward them, and she was looking in through the window as if she had known exactly where they were hiding. The assistant officer saw her too. He did not speak. The Marine did not speak either. For maybe 10 seconds, both men just sat there and stared back. The woman did not tap on the glass. She did not smile. She did not move her mouth. She simply stood outside the lounge, separated from them by one pane of glass and a few feet of hallway. Those 10 seconds felt much longer than 10 seconds. The Marine could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear the hum of the lights overhead. He could feel every instinct in his body telling him not to open the door. But there were two of them now, and fear has a strange way of turning into embarrassment when someone else is watching you be afraid. So they stood, slowly. Neither wanted to be the first to reach the door, but neither wanted to stay seated either. They moved toward it together, eyes still locked on the window. The woman remained where she was. She should have heard them. She should have backed away or spoken or done something that people do when people approach them. The assistant officer reached for the handle. The Marine braced himself, not sure for what. Then they pulled the door open and stepped out into the hallway. The woman was gone, not walking away, not running, not ducking into a room. Gone. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, bright and silent. They checked the nearby doors. They looked down the hall. They checked the stairwell. There was nowhere she could have gone without being seen. The hallway was too long, the timing too tight, and both of them had been looking at her through the glass until the second they opened the door. But now there was nothing there except light on the floor. For a while they walked around the deck together, not because they expected to find her, but because standing still felt worse. They checked corners they had already checked. They looked over the rail into the parking lot. The cars sat below in neat dark rows. No woman, no footsteps, no movement except the distant shimmer of base lights. Eventually they returned to the lounge. Neither of them had a good explanation, and neither seemed eager to invent one. They had both seen the same thing. They had both heard the running steps. And that meant neither man had the comfort of thinking it had happened only in his own head. Sometimes a shared experience makes you feel safer. This one did not. The strangest part was how ordinary the building looked afterward. The same doors, the same painted walls, the same dull military furniture in the lounge. Nothing had shifted. No dramatic mark had been left behind. And that made it feel almost insulting, because the place had just shown them something impossible, and then gone back to pretending it was only a barracks. Before the night ended, the two Marines made a quiet agreement. They would not tell anyone, at least not officially, not in a way that would follow them around the unit and turn into jokes every time someone stood duty. They both knew what would happen. Somebody would laugh, somebody would say they were tired, somebody would call them idiots. And honestly, those were the same explanations they wanted to believe. Tired eyes, reflections, a real woman moving faster than expected, footsteps echoing from another deck. But each explanation broke against the same simple facts. She had been below, then above. The footsteps had continued where no one was visible, and at 4 a.m, both men saw her looking through the lounge window. The Marine would later keep that promise for a long time. He did not go around telling the story to everyone who asked about strange things on base. He did not try to turn Building 5357 into a legend. But memory has a way of staying bright around the edges when fear is attached to it. And years later he could still picture the hallway. He could still see that woman at the far end of the second deck. He could still feel the sharp decision in his legs when he chose to leave instead of walk towards her. He could still hear the running on the catwalk outside the 4th deck lounge, a sound that should have belonged to boots and knees and breath, but somehow belonged to no one. And most of all, he could still see her through the window. That was the detail that made the story feel personal. The first time he had noticed her. The second time he had found her where she could not be. But the last time she found them. She came to the room where they had gone to avoid her and she looked in. Maybe there was a normal answer buried somewhere in the layout of that barracks. Maybe a visitor slipped through doors and stairwells with impossible timing. Maybe shadows and reflections made two tired Marines think they had seen the same person. But neither of them believed that when they opened the lounge door and found the hallway empty. Because people leave traces, even small ones. A door swinging shut, footsteps fading, a shadow at the end of the hall, a laugh, a curse, anything. But she left nothing. One moment she was framed in the glass watching them. The next there was only fluorescent light and a long, empty corridor. That is what made Building 53570 feel different after that night. It was not the idea that something lived there in the dramatic sense. It was the possibility that something passed through when the building was quiet, something that could move from parking lot to hallway to window without using the same rules as everyone else. The Marine finished the night, but he did not finish it alone. Neither man wanted that. And when daylight came, the barracks filled with ordinary noise again. Doors opened. Marines walked to breakfast. Someone laughed too loudly in the stairwell. Someone complained about duty. The building became boring again, which almost felt like another trick. But the image stayed exactly where it was. A woman below in the parking lot looking up. A woman at the end of the hallway waiting. A woman outside the lounge window, close enough to touch if the glass had not been there. And then nothing at all, as if she had stepped backward into a part of the building nobody living could enter. There are some places where you at least have a barrier between you and what you are seeing. A window, a hallway, a door you can choose not to open. But on the roads around Horno before dawn, there is no glass, no lounge, and no locked room to retreat into. There is only a pair of headlights, an empty stretch of pavement, and two figures appearing where they should have been visible long before. A little after 2 in the morning, on a quiet road inside Camp Pendleton, a Marine drove alone toward Camp Horno, with his headlights cutting through the dark. The base felt empty, in the way large military installations sometimes do at night. There were roads, signs, hills, and training areas everywhere, but no movement. It felt like he was the only person awake for miles. He was coming down from the airfield side, passing the ammo dump, and heading toward the long slope near the PFT trail. It was a route he knew well enough that he was not thinking too hard about it. Just another early drive to work. Just another dark stretch of road where your mind wanders, because the turns are familiar and nothing is supposed to happen. Camp Horno is not a place that looks haunted in the dramatic way people imagine. It is barracks, training roads, hills, brush and ugly little pockets of terrain that Marines learn to hate by walking through them. But at night, especially before dawn, the place can feel strangely old. The hills turn into silhouettes. The road disappears beyond the reach of your headlights. The Marine had heard stories about Horno before. Most people had. Stories about shapes in the fog, voices near training towns, people appearing in barracks, windows and strange things on the hills that did not behave like animals or Marines. But stories are easy to laugh at when you're hearing them in daylight surrounded by other people and bad coffee. That morning he was not thinking about ghost stories. He was just driving. His headlights rolled over the pavement, then over brush, then over road signs that flashed white for a second, before vanishing behind him. He passed the ammo area and started down the big hill. The base was quiet enough that even the engine sounded too loud. Then, as he came into one of the turns, 2 men appeared in his headlights. They were standing or walking near the road close enough that his hands tightened on the wheel. He hit the brakes harder than he meant to, because based on where they were, he should have seen them earlier. They had not stepped out from behind a truck. They had not come from a side road. They were just there. For 1 second, his mind did what minds do when something impossible happens. It tried to make it boring. Maybe they were Marines doing land navigation. Maybe they were from MCT and got turned around. Maybe they were role players or some unit had a weird early movement planned and nobody had bothered to warn anyone else. So he slowed down and looked at them more carefully. That was when the simple explanation began to fall apart. The 2 men were not wearing modern MOUT camis. They were wearing old green uniforms, the kind you see in dated training photos, or in gear displays not on Marines walking around Horno in the middle of the night. They had dark green Kevlar helmets on with no covers. Their body armour looked old too, more like flak jackets than the plate carriers Marines were used to seeing. They carried rifles, but even those looked wrong in the brief, harsh glare of the headlights. Everything about them belonged to another period, like they had walked out of an older version of the base. The Marine kept rolling forward, slowly staring through the windshield. He wanted one of them to wave or curse at him, or look annoyed that a vehicle had almost clipped them. He wanted any normal reaction. But the 2 figures did not seem startled. They did not jump back. They did not shield their eyes. They just remained there, caught in the headlights, without reacting the way people usually react to light. Then he noticed the part that made the back of his neck tighten. Nothing on them reflected. Not a buckle, not a rifle barrel, not the edge of a helmet, not a strap snap, or plastic piece of gear. The headlights hit them, but the light did not bounce back. It was almost as if the beams passed through them instead of landing on them. That detail was so strange that he almost rejected it while seeing it. He told himself the angle was bad. Maybe the gear was dirty. Maybe the fog or dust or windshield glare was messing with the light. But the rest of the road reflected normally. The signs reflected. The paint and rocks and little bits of trash along the shoulder reflected. Only the two men did not. As he drove closer, he expected them to step aside. Instead, they seemed to remain just outside the normal rules of distance, not quite approaching, not quite moving away. For a moment, he had the awful feeling that if he kept driving, he might pass through them, and because that thought was too much, he looked away just long enough to keep the vehicle under control. When he looked back, he was already passing them. He wanted to stop and ask what unit they were with. He wanted to roll down the window and say, "What are you guys doing out here?" But the question died before it reached his mouth. Something in him understood that a normal answer would not come back, and that maybe he did not want any answer at all. So he kept driving. His eyes flicked to the mirrors, but the darkness behind him swallowed the road too quickly. He could not see them clearly anymore. Still, he had the sense that they were back there, either standing in the lane or watching the taillights move away. His hand stayed tight on the wheel long after the turn was behind him. A minute later, he passed near an obstacle course and slowed down. This was the moment when a normal explanation should have appeared. If a unit was training, there should have been vehicles, instructors, road guards, headlamps, voices, Marines stumbling around in the dark something. But the area was empty. No formation, no gear, no movement at all. That made the whole thing feel worse. 2 Marines alone on a dark road would already be strange, but 2 Marines in outdated gear with no unit nearby, no visible training event, and no reflection from their equipment made no sense. The Marine drove on trying to build a reason out of scraps, and every reason collapsed before it was finished. Maybe they were new guys issued old gear for some field problem. But nobody was issuing gear that old like that. Maybe they were playing Op4. But why would Op4 walk exposed on a road at 2 in the morning, with no exercise nearby? Maybe they were part of some historical ceremony or display, but not there, not in the dark. The road stretched ahead empty again. That was almost the worst part. The base did not react. No alarm sounded. No radio call came in. No vehicle appeared from the opposite direction to prove other people were moving through the same world he was. The night simply closed around the moment, as if it had happened only for him. As he kept driving, the old stories about Horno came back to him whether he wanted them or not. The fog on the Alpha shelf, the little girl laughing in the trees, the woman in the barracks window, the shapes people said they had seen at the edge of training areas. He had never fully believed those stories, but now they felt less like entertainment and more like warnings people had passed along badly. He thought about how many Marines had trained on that land before him. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the long years after that, and the modern wars that sent generation after generation through the same hills. Camp Pendleton had seen endless young men arrive, sweat curse march full, get hurt, and sometimes not make it home from one place or another. Training is supposed to be controlled, but control does not mean harmless. Accidents happen. Vehicles roll, weapons fail. People get lost, crushed, overheated, drowned, or thrown into the wrong place at the wrong second. A base can look ordinary in daylight and still carry more unfinished moments than anyone wants to count. Maybe that was what his mind reached for, because it was the only explanation that felt close to the shape of what he had seen. 2 Marines from an older time still moving along a road they knew, wearing gear that had not belonged on living bodies for years. Not threatening him, not asking for help, just appearing in his headlights as if time had thinned for a few seconds. The Marine did not turn around. That is important. Some people like to imagine they would go back, slow down, check the shoulder, prove what they saw. But in the real moment alone, before dawn on an empty road, curiosity does not always win. Sometimes the body votes first. His body told him to keep driving. By the time he reached the more familiar parts of Horno, the sky was still dark, but the road felt normal again. That almost made him question himself. Maybe he had been half asleep. Maybe headlights and shadows had turned 2 actual Marines into something older and stranger. Maybe he had seen exactly what was there, but fear had added the rest. But the reflection detail would not leave him. He had driven at night enough to know what light does to gear. Even old gear gives something back. Metal, plastic, glass tape, a wet boot, the curve of a helmet, a rifle sling, something catches. Those 2 figures had caught nothing. The road around them had been real. They had looked less real than the road. Later, when he told the story, he did not try to make it bigger than it was. There were no screams, no vanishing in a burst of light, no hand pressed against the window. just two figures appearing too close, wearing the wrong era, and refusing to reflect his headlights, in a way that made it more believable and also more unsettling. Because the scariest moments on a base like Horno are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet enough that you can almost talk yourself out of them. A shape in fog, a laugh in trees, a woman through glass, two men in old gear beside the road. Nothing attacks you. Nothing explains itself. It simply appears, lets you see it, and then leaves you with the job of making sense of it. The Marine never found out whether anyone else saw the two figures that morning. He did not hear about a training event. He did not hear about lost students in old uniforms. No one came forward with a simple answer that turned the whole thing into a funny misunderstanding. And because no answer arrived, the memory stayed open. Over time, that open space became the part he returned to. He could remember the turn, the headlights, the old green camis, the dark helmets, the strange stillness. He could remember wanting to ask them what unit they were with. He could remember deciding not to, and he could remember the way the light touched everything except them. Maybe they were only Marines. Maybe there is some explanation buried in a schedule, a training plan or a trick of headlights and fatigue. But if that is true, then somewhere there were two men walking a dark road in outdated gear, silently letting a vehicle pass them without reacting, with no unit nearby and no reflection on their rifles. And if that is not true, then for a few seconds before dawn, a Marine driving into Horno saw something that belonged to a different hour, maybe even a different war. It did not chase him. It did not speak. It only stood in the road long enough for his headlights to prove that light does not always touch what it reveals. That is the image that stays with him. Two figures at the edge of the beam, old helmets, old flak jackets, faces hidden by glare and darkness. The road was empty before them, and empty after them. And between those two empty stretches, for just a moment, the past seemed to be walking across Camp Horno in silence. Old gear has a strange way of making people think about the bodies that once carried it. In a museum, those things are usually locked behind glass or parked behind ropes safe, and labelled turned into history you can walk past. But sometimes in a building full of tanks, radios and machines pulled from war, one of those old voices seems to find a way back through the static. Late one afternoon, inside a tank museum that was almost empty, 3 employees sat in the front lobby and watched the clock move toward closing time. The visitors were gone. The gift shop was quiet. Behind them in the main hall, rows of old armoured vehicles sat under the lights with their hatches open, looking less like exhibits and more like things waiting to be started. The museum displayed tanks and armoured vehicles from several wars, and many of them still worked. That was part of what made the place feel different from a normal museum. These were not clean replicas made for school trips. They were heavy machines with scraped paint-old radios, oil smells patched metal, and histories that did not always fit neatly onto the little signs beside them. Some of the tanks were from the Second World War. A few still had their original radios installed inside, and because the hatches were often left open for visitors to look through, sound carried out of them easily. If a kid climbed halfway into a turret and said something, you could hear it across the hall. The building itself seemed built to carry echoes. That day had been ordinary. Families had walked through. A few older men had stood quietly beside certain vehicles longer than everyone else. Kids had asked questions, touched things they were not supposed to touch, and tried to imagine what it would be like to sit inside one of those machines while it moved. Then slowly the museum emptied. By about 4:30, the boss had already left for the day. Only 3 employees remained sitting in the lobby and waiting out the last half hour before they could lock up. They were relaxed enough to joke around, tired enough to stop caring about the same conversations they had probably had all week. Behind them, the exhibit hall was still. Then a radio crackled somewhere inside the museum. All 3 employees stopped talking at the same time. It was not a tiny sound or something one person half imagined. It was loud, clear, and sudden, the kind of static burst that makes your shoulders tighten before you even understand why. At first no one moved. They just listened. The static continued for a second, then a man's voice came through it. The voice sounded distant but sharp, like someone speaking through old equipment under pressure. He asked when something was going to arrive. Then he asked if anyone else was in the area. Then there was a pause. One of the employees looked toward the front windows because the first reasonable explanation was that the sound had come from outside. Maybe a police car had pulled into the parking lot. Maybe a radio transmission from some emergency vehicle had bounced through the building. Maybe there was a truck out front with a speaker or some kind of equipment. But then the voice came again. This time it sounded more frantic. The man repeated the question, asking if anyone was nearby, asking about help or support, in a way that made the words feel older than the room they were in. It did not sound like modern dispatch chatter. It sounded like someone trying very hard not to panic. The employees stood up. The voice repeated itself 2 or 3 more times, each time tighter and more urgent. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the transmission cut off. The static vanished. The museum went silent again. For a few seconds, none of the 3 spoke. The old tanks in the hall sat exactly where they had been, hatches open like dark mouths. One employee finally said it had to be outside. They went to the front windows and looked into the parking lot. There were no police cars, no maintenance trucks, no one sitting in a vehicle with a radio on. The lot was empty in that flat late afternoon way, where every parked car looks abandoned for a minute. Then they checked their own walkie-talkies. The museum sometimes used them for events, and maybe one had been left on or caught a stray signal. But when they found the set, the radios were switched off. No batteries dying, no open channel. Nothing that should have produced a man's voice loud enough to fill the building. The museum did not have an intercom system either. There was no hidden speaker network, no PA setup, no normal way for a voice to suddenly come from everywhere and nowhere. And that was when all 3 employees began thinking about the same thing. The tanks. More specifically, the tanks with old radios still sitting inside them. None of them wanted to say it first, because saying it made the idea feel less stupid and more possible. But the main hall was behind them, and in that hall were several machines with open hatches and old radio sets that had once been used in war. If the sound had come from inside one of those vehicles, there was no obvious reason why. They walked into the exhibit hall together. The place felt large now that the visitors were gone. Every boot step tapped against the floor and came back from the walls. They moved past the tanks, slowly shining lights into compartments, peering through hatches, checking for someone hiding as a prank or a guest who had been accidentally locked in early. They found no one. No child, no visitor, no co-worker trying to scare them. The radios inside the tanks were old, silent and dead-looking. Some were more display than equipment at that point. Others may have had pieces intact, but nothing was powered in a way that made sense. There was no voice waiting inside any of them. Still, the employees could not shake the feeling that the voice had come from deeper in the museum. Not from outside, not from the lobby. It had filled the building in the same way an engine vibration might fill it, using the metal and the open hatches, and the empty space as if the whole hall were one large speaker. By then it was nearly 5 o'clock, and all 3 of them wanted to leave. That was the simple answer. Close the museum lock, the doors go home, and let daylight deal with whatever had happened. So they began the normal closing routine, moving from door to door, checking locks, making sure side rooms were empty, turning off what needed to be turned off. The back door was part of that routine, even though nobody really used it. One employee checked it and confirmed it was shut and locked. Nothing strange there, no sign of anyone forcing it open, no cool draft, no loose latch, no reason to think anyone had gone in or out. They finished the checks and returned to the security panel. Then they tried to arm the alarm. The system refused. A warning on the panel said the back door was open, the same back door they had just checked, the same door no one used, the same door that had been closed and locked only minutes earlier. The employees looked at the panel, then at one another, and nobody laughed. They went back through the museum again, this time faster. The exhibit hall felt different on the return walk because now they had to pass the tanks again, and every open hatch seemed like a place something could be listening from. They reached the back door. It was closed, it was locked. The handle did not move, the frame was secure. One of them said it was probably a glitch. That was the kind of thing people say when the alternative is too annoying to carry. Security systems glitch. Sensors go bad. Old buildings have wiring issues. All of that was true. So they walked back to the front, told themselves the problem was electronic, and tried to arm the system again. This time the panel said the back door was open, and now a few other doors were open too. But they were not. The employees had just checked them. There had been no time for someone to move through the building. Opening doors behind them, and even if someone had, they would have heard footsteps, seen movement, felt some normal sign of another person. The 3 employees stood in the lobby with the security panel glowing in front of them. Behind them, the museum was quiet again. That quiet was worse than the radio. At least the radio had been obvious. A voice, static words. This was just the building insisting that doors were open when their own hands had confirmed they were not. They had a choice: keep investigating or leave. And sometimes when people tell these stories later, they act like they wish they had pushed harder, gone deeper, checked every tank, opened every door again. But in the moment, standing inside a nearly dark museum full of war machines, after hearing a dead radio voice leaving, feels like the only intelligent thing a person can do. So they left. They locked what they could, got out of the building, and did not spend any extra time in the parking lot. 5 o'clock had seemed far away all afternoon. Now it felt like they should have been gone an hour earlier. None of them had an explanation, but all three had heard the voice, and all three had watched the alarm system fail in the same impossible way. Later they talked about it among themselves many times. They tried to rebuild the sound, the first burst of static, the man's voice, the repeated questions, the way the voice got more desperate before it disappeared. They could not remember every word, but they remembered the feeling of it. It sounded like someone asking for help while something was going very wrong. That was the part that made the tanks feel different afterward. Before they were exhibits. Impressive, heavy, historically important, but still objects behind ropes and signs. After that day, at least for those employees, the open hatches looked less like access points for visitors and more like wounds in metal openings into places where men had once sat with their hearts racing. Because those radios had not been built for museums. They had been built for crews who needed to know where to move, when to fire, whether help was coming, whether anyone else was still alive nearby. A frantic voice over static would not have been strange inside a tank in combat. It would have been part of the world those machines came from. The employees eventually asked some of the older staff about it. Not everyone wanted to talk. That was its own kind of answer. People who had been around the museum longer admitted there were stories about strange activity in the building. Some called it a poltergeist. Some just said weird things happened sometimes, and it was better not to make a big show of them. That bothered the employees almost as much as the event itself. If nobody had ever heard anything strange there before, they might have filed it away as one bizarre afternoon. But learning that older staff had stories too made the radio transmission feel less like a random glitch and more like one moment in a pattern they had accidentally stepped into. And maybe that is what places like that collect without meaning to. A museum gathers objects, but objects do not always arrive empty. A helmet may have been worn by someone who was scared. A uniform may have been folded after its owner never came back. A radio may have carried the last calm sentence a man ever heard, before the world around him broke apart. The museum did not become a horror movie after that. The next day lights came on doors, opened, visitors arrived, and people walked through the tank hall, reading plaques and taking pictures. Kids still pointed at the vehicles. Adults still asked practical questions about armour and engines and guns. The world moved on because that is what the world does. But for the three employees, closing time was never exactly the same. When the last visitors left and the main hall settled, they knew what it sounded like when it was truly quiet. And they also knew that quiet could be interrupted by a voice that had no source asking for help from somewhere no living person was standing. The image that stays is simple. 3 employees in a front lobby half an hour from going home, suddenly listening to a man speak through static from inside a museum full of open tanks. He asks if anyone is in the area. He asks when something is going to arrive. And with each repeat, he sounds less like a recording, and more like someone realizing no answer is coming. Then the voice cuts out. The hall returns to silence. The tanks remain still under the lights. But when the employees try to leave the building, tells them the back door is open, then tells them other doors are open too, as if something unseen is moving through the museum after the last human voice has stopped. That is why the story lingers. Not because anyone saw a ghost standing beside a tank, not because a door slammed in someone's face. It lingers because the sound was so specific. A man on a radio. A question about help. A rising panic. The kind of voice that does not belong in a museum unless the past has found a way to transmit for a few seconds. Old radios were made to carry voices through noise, distance, smoke and fear. Sometimes they carried orders, sometimes coordinates, sometimes the last words of men who were already too far away to save. In that museum, one of those voices seemed to slip through again, and for 7 seconds the tank hall was not a display. It was somewhere waiting for reinforcements. A voice can make old metal feel alive, but some objects do not call out. They stay quiet behind glass, polished and labelled, until someone walks into the room, believing he can speak to whatever is attached to them. And in an old military museum in the United Kingdom, one man would learn that a silent sword can be much louder than a radio. In an old military museum in the United Kingdom, a staff member was walking toward his office one day when he glanced at a locked glass cabinet and stopped. Inside the cabinet were old photographs of soldiers, each one carefully labelled for visitors. But now every label had been knocked over and placed across the faces in the pictures. The cabinet was sealed. It was locked. It was not the kind of display someone could casually reach into and rearrange without leaving some obvious sign. And yet the labels were no longer where they belonged. They had been moved just enough to feel deliberate, like someone did not want those faces seen. At first, the staff member tried to stay practical. Museums are full of little problems that look stranger than they are. Vibrations can shift a loose label. A co-worker might have opened the case earlier and forgotten to mention it. A visitor might have bumped the glass. But even as he listed those explanations in his head, none of them really fit. The building itself was old enough to make almost any sound seem possible. It dated back to the 13th century and stood on the grounds of a cathedral that had been there for just as long. Before it ever became a military museum, it had stored church robes and passed through centuries of ordinary and not so ordinary human life. By the time the staff member worked there, the museum held weapons, uniforms, documents, captured equipment, and all the small physical pieces that war leaves behind. Visitors saw history in glass cases. The staff saw the rooms before the lights came on, and after the doors closed when the objects stopped feeling educational and started feeling personal. And among the employees there were stories. Not the kind everyone put on brochures, and not the kind management wanted shouted at tourists. The place was supposed to teach history and honour the people connected to it. It was not supposed to become a ghost attraction, so when people talked about the strange things there, they usually did it quietly. Most of the ghosts, if that is what they were considered harmless enough. A sound in a room, a door moving, the feeling that someone had just walked behind you and no one had. But there were two areas staff treated differently. One was the library, the other was the attic, which the museum used as an armoury. The library had its own reputation. People said if you annoyed whatever was in there, doors could slam hard enough to make you jump out of your skin. Chairs could move. Small things could happen that made you leave the room faster than you entered it. But the attic was worse. The staff did not joke as much about the attic. Up there under the roof, the museum stored some of its most interesting and unsettling objects. Captured enemy weapons, old uniforms and swords, guns, equipment carried by people who had gone into places they may never have come back from. The armoury was fascinating in daylight, but even then it carried a weight that made people lower their voices without meaning to. One of the older museum assistants, a man named Alistair, knew the stories better than almost anyone. He had worked there for years and seemed to understand which rooms could be ignored and which rooms should be respected. He did not run around trying to scare new staff. If anything, he avoided talking too much about the attic unless someone asked directly. That was why when a psychic medium came to the museum one day, people paid attention. The man seemed confident, maybe too confident the way some people do when they believe they can walk into a strange place and immediately understand what everyone else has only felt in fragments. He spoke with Alistair and asked about the building's spirits. At some point the conversation turned to the attic armoury. Alistair told him, or at least hinted, that something up there was not friendly. The medium did not seem frightened. Instead, he said he could go up and find out who or what was there. In his mind, this was apparently something he knew how to handle. So Alistair led him up toward the armoury. The stairs narrowed as they climbed. The air changed the way it often does in old upper rooms, becoming warmer in some places and colder in others, with dust hanging in the light. When they reached the attic, Alistair showed him around and pointed out the displays. There were rows of weapons, some behind glass, some arranged for storage. Among them were Japanese officer swords captured during the Second World War. They were beautiful in the way dangerous objects can be beautiful, all clean lines and polished metal, but the beauty did not make them feel safe. If anything, it made them feel more aware. The medium looked around the room and said he would need about half an hour. Alistair asked if he was sure. The man said yes. So Alistair left him there alone, closing the distance between himself and the attic with every step down the stairs. Maybe he expected the man to sit quietly and meditate. Maybe he expected nothing at all. For the next 30 minutes, the museum went on around them. Footsteps moved through other rooms. Staff worked on exhibits. Visitors read plaques and leaned over cases. Downstairs, everything had the ordinary rhythm of a public building. But above them in the attic armory, one man was alone with the swords, the uniforms, and whatever the staff believed had settled there. When the half-hour passed, Alistair went back up. He climbed the stairs toward the attic, expecting at most to find the medium looking tired or serious. Maybe the man would say he had sensed a name. Maybe he would describe a soldier, a data feeling. That was probably the sort of thing Alistair was prepared for. But when he reached the armory, he heard shouting. Not a calm ritual voice, not chanting, shouting. Alistair stepped into the room and saw the medium facing a wall, yelling at it, as if someone was standing directly in front of him. His body was tense, his voice harsh, and in his hands, raised high over his head, was one of the Japanese swords. For a second, Alistair could only stare. The man had not just touched an artifact. He had taken a weapon and was holding it like he was about to bring it down on someone. But there was no one in front of him. Only the wall. Only the attic. Only the objects in their cases and the old room around them. Then Alistair moved. He spoke to the man, trying to keep his voice calm, trying not to startle him into swinging the blade. The medium did not respond like a normal person hearing his name. He seemed locked onto whatever he believed was in front of him, or whatever had made him believe the wall was not empty. Alistair managed to get close enough to take the sword from him. That alone must have felt like crossing a wire. One wrong move and a strange museum story becomes a real injury in a room full of historic weapons. But somehow Alistair got the blade away and returned it to its place before guiding the man toward the stairs. The medium still seemed wrong as they left the attic. He did not talk the way he had before. He moved like someone being led out of a room after waking from a dream too quickly. Alistair kept him moving down the stairs, away from the armory, away from the wall, away from the sword he had been holding over his head. Then, as they reached the lower floor, something changed. It was as if the man came back into himself. His face shifted, his eyes focused. He turned to Alistair with genuine confusion and fear, and asked, "What the hell happened in there?" The question landed harder than any explanation would have, because if he had been faking, he should have remembered the performance. If he had been showing off, he should have continued the act downstairs. But he sounded like someone who had lost time, someone who entered the attic as one person and came out with a blank space where the worst part should have been. After that, the attic's reputation did not improve. Staff still had to work around it. Exhibits still had to be maintained. Objects still had to be catalogued, cleaned, protected, and moved when needed. But there is a difference between knowing a room has stories and seeing a grown man come out of it, asking what he had done, and the sword went back behind glass or back into storage exactly where it belonged. That is the part that feels almost too neat. The object returned to its proper place. The room returned to silence. The museum continued functioning. Visitors could walk under the old roof and never know that not long before someone had stood there with a blade raised at an empty wall. The staff member who later told the story did not present it like proof of anything. He did not claim to know what spirit was in the attic or what it wanted. He only described what the museum already felt like to the people who worked there. Mostly safe, usually quiet, but with certain places where respect was not just politeness, it was self-preservation. That is how old buildings change the people who work inside them. You learn which doors creak because the hinges are bad, and which doors seem to close only when someone says the wrong thing. You learn which drafts come from broken seals, and which cold spots make people stop talking. You learn when to laugh and when not to. The locked photograph cabinet became part of that larger pattern. Labels placed over faces, a library that did not like being disturbed, an attic armory, where a medium lost time and lifted a sword at someone no one else could see. None of those pieces proved the others, but together they made the museum feel less like a collection and more like a place that remembered being touched. And maybe that is the unsettling thing about war objects. They are often cleaned, labelled and made safe for viewing, but they were not born as educational tools. A sword was made for a hand. A rifle was made for a shoulder. A uniform was made for a body. Before they became artifacts, they belonged to moments where someone may have been terrified, furious, wounded, or dying. If anything can carry a residue, it would be something like that. Not because metal has a soul in any simple way, but because humans pour meaning into objects when the stakes are high enough. A wedding ring can carry love. A child's toy can carry grief. So maybe a captured sword can carry whatever was in the room when it last came down. Or maybe the medium was unstable. Maybe he convinced himself there was something in the attic and slipped into some kind of psychological episode. Maybe the old room, the stories and the weapons pushed his imagination too far. That is the safe explanation. And it is not impossible. But it does not explain why the staff were already wary of that room before he ever climbed the stairs. It also does not explain the look on his face when he came back to himself. People can act. People can exaggerate. But confusion has a texture to it. Fear does too. And according to the story, when the medium asked what had happened in there, he sounded like a man who truly did not know why his hands had been wrapped around a sword. In the end, no one held a formal investigation. No camera footage was presented. No expert came in to declare the attic haunted or safe. The museum simply continued the way old institutions do. Exhibits were opened. Lights were turned on. Visitors arrived. Staff did their jobs while quietly avoiding jokes that felt a little too close to certain rooms. But somewhere above them, the attic remained. The captured swords remained. The wall the medium shouted at remained. And whatever had made him raise the blade, whether it came from the room or from inside himself, remained unanswered. Sometimes that is enough to change how a person walks through a building. The image that stays is not the whole museum. It is not even the locked cabinet or the library doors. It is one man in an attic armory, facing a wall, shouting at something no one else can see, holding a Japanese officer's sword high over his head, as if he has been pulled into a fight that ended decades before he was born. Then the blade is taken from him. He is led downstairs. The air changes, his eyes clear. And in the normal light below the attic, he turns to the man beside him and asks what happened, as if the room above has kept the answer for itself. A sword can be returned to its case, and people can pretend that means the danger is contained. But some objects are too large for glass and too scarred for silence. In another museum, a helicopter from Vietnam sat with bullet patches across its body and no power in its frame. Still, every so often its red beacon appeared to blink in the dark. Inside an aviation museum filled with old military aircraft, one helicopter sat under the lights with bullet patches scattered across its frame. It was a Vietnam-era Huey, the kind of aircraft people recognise even if they do not know much about war. The doors were still there, the shape was still familiar, but the machine itself was dead. At least it was supposed to be. There was no battery connected to it. No power ran through the airframe. Nothing inside was wired in a way that should have made lights blink, radios crackle, or instruments move. It was a preserved exhibit, now something visitors walked past with cameras and questions. But according to some people who worked around it, the Huey did not always behave like an exhibit. The first strange reports were easy to dismiss. People heard voices near the helicopter, low and unclear, as if someone had spoken from inside the cabin or just behind the aircraft. In a museum, that kind of thing can happen. Sound carries in odd ways. A child across the hangar can sound like they are right beside you. A tour guide's voice can bounce off metal and glass. So when someone said they heard talking around the Huey, most people did not panic. They looked around for visitors, checked the nearby displays and moved on. But then the stories kept coming. A voice near the aircraft when no one was standing there. A shape in a photograph that nobody remembered seeing. A feeling hard to describe that the helicopter was not as empty as it looked. The strangest detail involved the red collision beacon. It was one of those aircraft lights meant to flash so other pilots could see the helicopter in the sky. On a museum floor with no power connected, it should have been nothing more than a piece of plastic and metal. But people said they had seen it blink, not reflect. Blink. That was the detail that made staff look closer. Reflections happen all the time in museums. Lights hit polished surfaces, glass cases, camera flashes, even the watch on someone's wrist. But the people who saw this did not describe a quick sparkle. They described the beacon lighting up from within a small red pulse on a dead aircraft that had no reason to signal anything. To understand why that bothered people so much, you have to understand what the Huey had been before it became a museum piece. It had not been built to sit cleanly under lights while families read plaques. It had flown in Vietnam, carrying cargo crew's wounded men, and the kind of fear that has no place in a peaceful room. If you looked closely at its body, you could still see where bullets had struck and been patched over. Those marks were not decorative. They were scars. Every one of them meant that at some point somebody had been shooting at this aircraft, and somebody inside it had been hoping the metal around them would be enough. One of the men who flew that Huey was a pilot named Doug Hatter. During the war, he was flying from one city in South Vietnam to another when the helicopter suffered a catastrophic failure. The tail rotor system began to come apart. For a helicopter, that is not a small problem. That is the kind of failure that can turn a controlled flight into a falling machine very quickly. The Huey was carrying a heavy load that day, and strangely that weight may have helped keep it somewhat stable. Doug managed to guide the aircraft toward a practice landing strip. It was not a graceful landing. It came down hard and the impact tore the tail boom away from the rest of the helicopter, but everyone aboard survived. Afterward, the Huey was salvaged and sent back to Fort Worth, Texas, where it was rebuilt. A lot of machines would have ended their story right there broken after a near-fatal crash. But this one returned to service. It went back to Vietnam and took on a role that may have left even more behind inside its frame. It became a medevac helicopter. That meant it carried the wounded off battlefields. It carried men who were bleeding, screaming, unconscious, praying, or already gone. It carried crew members who had to keep working, while people in the back fought to stay alive. It carried fear in both directions into danger and away from it. That is what made the later museum stories feel different. A random old helicopter blinking in the dark would be odd. A medevac Huey with bullet scars and crash history blinking in the dark felt like something else. It felt less like a malfunction and more like a memory repeating a signal it had once needed to send. Some visitors said photographs of the Huey came out wrong. They would take a picture look at it later and notice shapes that looked like people near or inside the aircraft. But when the photo had been taken, nobody had been standing there. Maybe it was blur, maybe reflections, maybe another visitor passing behind glass. That is always possible. Still, when enough people say the same kind of thing about the same machine, the easy explanations start to feel a little thin. A voice can be echo, a light can be reflection, a photograph can be an artifact. But when the voices, the light, the photographs and the history all point toward one aircraft, people begin to treat the area around it with a different kind of respect. The museum staff did not necessarily talk about it loudly. Places like that are built to preserve history, not to become ghost attractions. A helicopter like that represents real pilots, real crew chiefs, real wounded men, and real families who never stop carrying what happened over there. Turning it into a cheap scare would feel wrong. But respect and fear can live in the same room. A person can look at the Huey and understand it as a historic aircraft, while also feeling that standing beside it after closing time would be different from standing beside a clean civilian display. Some machines have a presence. This one seemed to have earned its own, and maybe that is because a helicopter is intimate. In a way a tank or a ship is not. It is loud, cramped, vibrating, exposed. People sit close together. They shout over the engine. They bleed on the floor. They grip straps and rifles and stretchers. In a medevac Huey, the aircraft is not just transportation. It is the thin moving room between death and help. Imagine the cabin during one of those flights. The rotors hammering above. The door gunner watching the ground. A medic leaning over a wounded man, trying to keep pressure on a wound while the helicopter banks. Someone calling out numbers. Distance landing zone. Blood type pulse. The red beacon outside blinking into the sky because other aircraft need to know they are there. Now imagine the same aircraft decades later silent under museum lights. No engine. No rotor wash. No radio traffic. No one dying in the back. The beacon should be dark. The cabin should be empty. But then for one brief second, that red light appears to pulse again, as if some part of the Huey still believes it is in the air and needs to be seen. There is no way to prove that, of course. The rational answer is always nearby. Electrical residue, a hidden wire, a reflection from another display, a camera angle, a visitor's memory reshaping what they saw, and maybe every strange report around that aircraft can be explained if someone has enough time and the right equipment. But the people who worked around it also knew what they had checked. They knew there was no battery connected. They knew the aircraft was not sitting there quietly powered and waiting for some loose switch to wake up. They knew how dead it was supposed to be. That was exactly why the little red blink stayed in their minds. The story of Doug Hatter adds another layer, though not in the way some people might expect. He survived the Huey crash in Vietnam, but years later he died in another helicopter crash, while flying with photographers, near Mount St. Helens. That does not mean his spirit haunted the Huey. The people telling the story were careful not to claim that. But it adds to the feeling that these machines collect endings. A helicopter can be repaired, metal can be patched, systems can be rebuilt, paint can be redone. But the events connected to it do not simply vanish because mechanics replace parts. The Huey in the museum had been damaged, returned, used again, retired and preserved. It had outlived some of the people whose lives passed through it. That is why some staff believed old war machines have souls, or at least something close enough that the word makes sense. Not a soul like a person has maybe, but an accumulation. A memory made of oil heat blood radio calls flight hours, bullet strikes and hands gripping the frame when the world outside was trying to kill everyone inside. The Huey's haunting, if that is what it was, did not seem angry. It did not chase people. It did not slam doors or throw objects. It simply made itself known in small ways. A voice where no one stood. A person in a photo who had not been there. A red light blinking when no current should have reached it. That almost makes it sadder. Some hauntings feel like warnings, some feel like tricks. This one feels like an aircraft trying to continue a duty it no longer has. Be seen. Be heard. Carry them out. Signal in the dark. Keep moving. Except now it cannot move. It can only sit on a museum floor while people walk around it and read a shortened version of its life. By day, visitors probably saw a cool old helicopter. Kids pointed at the bullet patches. Veterans may have gone quiet for a few seconds longer than everyone else. Parents took pictures. Someone read the sign, nodded and moved to the next exhibit. That is how museums work. They turn massive histories into things people can understand in a few minutes. But after hours, when the crowds left and the hangar settled, the Huey became something else again. Its cabin darkened. Its patched skin caught the last of the overhead lights. The red beacon sat still on the frame waiting. And for anyone who knew the stories waiting near it too long, probably felt like listening for a heartbeat inside metal. The image that stays is not dramatic. It is not a ghost pilot in the seat or a full crew appearing in the cabin. It is only a small red blink on an aircraft that should be dead. One pulse, then darkness. Just enough to make a person stop walking and look back, wondering if they really saw it. And if they did see it, then the question becomes harder than it sounds. What was the Huey signalling? Was it only a trick of light? Or was some old part of the aircraft still calling out across time? Still trying to mark its position? Still trying to tell someone in the dark, we are here, we are here, we are here. War leaves behind more than names on plaques. It leaves metal fabric photographs, empty seats and machines that survive long after the people inside them are gone. Sometimes those machines are quiet. Sometimes they seem to blink once from the corner of a hangar. And sometimes an entire stone building carries so many old deaths that the walls themselves seem to breathe. At about 8:30, on a quiet morning in Ireland, a tour guide walked through the undercroft of a medieval castle before the first visitors arrived. The lights were already on, but the space still felt half asleep. He was heading toward the courtyard, thinking about the ordinary work of opening towers and preparing for tours, when a cold rush of air passed straight through his right side. It was not just a draft brushing his sleeve. It felt like something moved through him close enough that the hair on his arms lifted all at once. Then he heard what sounded like an exhale beside him, soft and human, as if someone had been standing there in the dark and breathing inches from his ear. He turned toward the tombs, but nothing was there. The guide had worked at the castle for years, and before that job he would have called himself a skeptic. He knew old buildings made old building noises. Stone shifted, pipes knocked, wind found cracks that no one could see. But this was different, because the sound had not come from the walls. It had come from right beside him. He turned the other way, looking down the remains of an old corridor that led toward the southern wall. That was when he saw it. A dark, wispy figure was moving through the corridor ahead of him. It was not a shadow sliding across a wall. It had mass enough that as it moved, it blocked the light from the lamps behind it. For a second, the guide just watched. The figure drifted down the passage, rounded a corner, and continued toward a siege tunnel. It did not hurry. It did not react to him. It simply moved like it belonged there more than he did. And then it was gone, swallowed by the turn in the stone. His first reaction was not a scream. It was a laugh which surprised even him. But sometimes the mind reaches for the least useful response because the useful ones are not available. He stood there in the undercroft alone, before opening time, laughing at something that was not funny at all. Then he left the area and refused to go back down there for nearly 2 weeks. To understand why that sight stayed with him, you have to understand the castle itself. It was not a little decorative ruin on a hill. It was a 13th century fortress that had been through sieges, starvation disease, executions, military occupation, and centuries of people using the same stone rooms for very different kinds of fear. The castle had towers, a dungeon, hidden prison cells, burial pits, and staircases that turned sharply enough to make the air feel trapped. Some parts were open to visitors. Other parts were closed off, except to staff. The tour guide had access to places most people never saw, which meant he also had to walk through the building at times when it felt least like a museum. Before it became a visitor attraction, the castle had served many lives. At one point, it was a British military installation. Later parts of it were used for social housing. But the bloodiest chapters came earlier, during the 17th century, when the castle and the city around it were pulled into siege after siege, until the walls became less like protection and more like a trap. During one siege, civilians were forced inside the castle to survive. The problem was that the castle could not properly feed them. Soldiers and civilians began starving together. Disease spread in the crowded rooms. People weakened, collapsed, and died inside the walls, while those still alive waited for the siege to break, and wondered if they would last that long. Another siege was even worse. Women and children who tried to escape were forced back into the city. Anyone caught fleeing could be executed, and heads were displayed as warnings, outside gates and along the riverbank facing the castle. The message was simple and cruel: stay inside and starve, or come out and die where everyone can see. Then there was the bridge. During another attack, hundreds of retreating soldiers were trapped when the drawbridge was raised too soon. Enemy forces pressed them from one side, while the freezing river waited on the other. Men on the castle walls later said the screaming continued for hours. By the time it ended, the bridge and river had taken everyone caught there. Even now, the river still gives pieces back. Because of changes to its course and modern dredging, old artifacts are pulled up from the water from time to time. Cannonballs, fragments, objects from men who died so long ago that their names are gone, but whose things are still being lifted out of the mud like the river has not finished testifying. So when employees talk about the castle feeling haunted, they are not starting from nothing. Security guards have reported hurried footsteps following them up stairwells. Electricians have heard the same thing while working alone. Visitors have seen figures in windows and gaunt shapes moving in towers where no one should be walking. One tower is known for a figure who appears in an archer's nest, then walks toward a corridor that has been walled up for decades. People say footsteps follow them on that staircase, quick and close, like someone is rushing behind them, but never catching up. If you stop, they stop. If you climb, they climb with you. High-E. Another part of the castle leads down toward the dungeon. That stairwell is not usually open to the public, partly because it is dangerous with an old trap built into the steps. The dungeon itself can flood depending on the river tide. When the water is low enough to enter the air, down there feels heavy, as if the room still expects someone to be left in it. People have reported screams and crying coming from that southern tower. Not loud enough to draw a crowd every time, but clear enough that staff do not always joke about it afterward. There are places where a person can hear a sound and immediately search for the speaker, and there are places where the sound itself tells you not to. The gatehouse has its own stories. One figure, called the Big Fellow by some of the staff, is said to pace through the upper rooms. Another presence is associated with jangling keys. There is also a smoking man believed by local legend to have been an officer who died standing beneath the arch after suffering a sudden aneurysm. On misty mornings, people across the courtyard have reported seeing an amber glow under that arch, like the ember of a cigarette briefly lighting in a place where nobody is standing. It is not much, just a small glow in the damp air. But small details can be worse than full apparitions because they feel casual, as if the dead are simply keeping their old routines. One of the saddest stories belongs to the northeastern tower. During one of the sieges, a civilian woman was found hiding there when soldiers stormed the castle. Local legend says she was assaulted and murdered against the wall of the room. Since then, people have spoken of a figure called the Black Lady tied to that space. There is a damp patch on the wall in that room that stonemasons have tried to explain across different eras. It has been examined more than once, and still no one has given a satisfying reason for why that one area remains wet. The legend says if you hear singing, their good fortune may follow. If you hear weeping, it is a warning. During excavations in the courtyard, skeletal remains were found near the entrance to that tower, including the remains of a pregnant woman. That does not prove the legend exactly. History rarely hands you proof that clean. But it gives the story weight. It places real bones near the place where people already felt something terrible had happened. And that is the thing about this castle. It does not feel haunted by one clean ghost story. It feels layered. Starvation in one century, siege in another, soldiers on a bridge, prisoners in hidden cells, women hiding in towers, families living in rooms where other people once died. The building does not hold a single tragedy. It holds too many. The guide knew many of these stories because telling them was part of his job. He could talk about the sieges in daylight. He could point toward towers, explain what an oubliette was, describe military use, and move visitors along before the mood got too heavy. In a group, history becomes manageable. You turn it into sentences, you keep walking. But being alone in the Undercroft was different. There was no group to perform for, no visitor asking questions, no co-worker nearby, just old stone electric lamps the direction of the tombs, and a corridor where a dark figure had moved with enough substance to block light. In that moment, history stopped being a story and became a presence. After he saw the figure, he avoided that area as much as he could. For nearly 2 weeks, he found reasons to delay reroute, or let someone else handle what had to be done there. That was not easy because the Undercroft was part of his job. But fear is very good at making practical arguments. It tells you there is always another way to get across a building. Eventually, he did go back. Work has a way of forcing bravery, even when bravery is just doing the thing you are paid to do, with your heart beating too fast. But going back did not mean he dismissed what happened. It only meant he learned to move through that space, with the knowledge that he had seen something there once. And maybe that is how people survive working in places like that. They do not solve the haunting. They adapt to it. They learn which tower feels wrong after closing. They learn which staircase makes guards look over their shoulders. They learn to respect rooms with stories older than anyone alive, not because every legend is true, but because enough of them feel earned. A skeptic can explain one sound. A skeptic can explain a draft. A skeptic can explain a shadow, a reflection, a trick of the eyes before coffee on a dark morning. But it becomes harder when a figure blocks the lamp behind it, moves down a corridor, turns into a siege tunnel, and leaves you laughing because your mind has no better tool. The guide never claimed he understood what he saw. He did not say it was a soldier, a prisoner, a woman from the tower, or one of the dead from the bridge. He only knew it moved like something that had somewhere to go. And in a castle full of sealed corridors, hidden cells and old paths, no longer used by the living, that may be the most unsettling part. Because the dead in a place like that, if they remain at all, may not be wandering aimlessly. They may be repeating routes, down stairwells, across towers, through corridors that have been walled up, into tunnels where footsteps once meant escape, defense, or death. And every now and then someone opens the building early enough to see the route still being walked. By daylight, the castle becomes a museum again. Tourists come through the gate, children run ahead in the courtyard, guides speak clearly and point to stonework, cameras click, people read signs and learn dates. The building allows itself to be understood in pieces small enough to carry. Then the doors close, the crowds leave, and the pieces seem to join back together. That is when the castle feels oldest. Not because it is quiet, but because the quiet does not feel empty. It feels occupied by everything that has ever happened there. The sieges, the hunger, the river, the prison cells, the woman in the tower, the men on the bridge, the breath in the Undercroft. All of it seems to remain just behind the stone. The image that stays is not a grand apparition under moonlight. It is a guide alone on a work morning stopping, because a cold rush of air has passed through him. He turns toward the tombs and sees nothing. Then he turns toward the corridor and sees a dark figure moving away, blocking the lamps as it goes. It rounds the corner into the siege tunnel without looking back. The guide laughs because there is nothing else to do. And for the next 2 weeks, the part of the castle he knows best becomes the one place he does not want to enter. In a building that has survived centuries of death, sometimes the most frightening thing is not a scream. It is a shadow that still knows the way. Looking back at all 12 stories, the most frightening thing is not always death, a ghost, or some horrifying detail discovered too late. What is more frightening is how often people walk into danger through completely ordinary decisions. Someone stops their car because they believe it is the police. Someone eats food that tastes strange, but assumes the chef made a mistake. Someone trusts a spiritual healer because the whole village trusts him too. The first lesson is that trust is not wrong, but trust should not be allowed to fall asleep. Kim Medlin trusted the lights behind her car because in ordinary life, police lights mean order, protection, and safety. But that familiar meaning was exactly what a dangerous person exploited. A civilized society needs trust in its systems, but every person also needs permission to question a situation when it no longer feels right. In Kim's story, the most painful part is that she did many of the things a careful person is supposed to do. She had reported the road rage incident. She called her husband while driving late at night. She paid attention to where she was and when she should be home. But the danger did not arrive looking like a dangerous stranger. It came in the shape of lawful authority, and because of that, it passed through her natural defences. The message here is not to live in fear, and it is not to distrust everyone. The message is that when you are alone at night, especially on an empty road, you should give yourself the right to verify what is happening. If you are being pulled over and something feels wrong, turn on your hazard lights, call emergency services, state your location, and drive slowly to a brighter public area, if possible. Politeness matters less than survival. The story of the water tower in China teaches a different lesson. Sometimes the truth announces itself through small signs, but people explain those signs in the least frightening way possible. Customers said the food tasted strange. The manager thought the chef had made a mistake. The chef thought an ingredient had gone bad. No one imagined a dead body inside the water supply because that thought was too far outside ordinary life. Everyday life depends on things we almost never look at: water, electricity, food systems, pipes, supply chains. Because they are so familiar, they become invisible. When one invisible system becomes contaminated, an entire community can be affected before anyone understands what is happening. That is why public safety does not belong only to the police. It also depends on inspection, maintenance, transparency, and fast response. A very clear educational lesson is this: when many independent people report the same problem, do not treat it as a small complaint. One customer disliking a meal could be personal taste. 10 customers at different restaurants reporting the same strange flavour in the water is data. In families, schools, companies, or societies, repeated signals from multiple sources deserve serious attention. The story of the spiritual healer in Malaysia shows the danger of letting personal reputation replace evidence. Qasim was trusted because he held a spiritual role in the community. When he led people to the victim's body, that trust grew stronger. But what looked like supernatural ability was actually the knowledge of a guilty man. He knew where the body was because he had put it there. The lesson is not to mock belief. In many communities, rituals and faith can offer real comfort. But when a crime has occurred, belief must come after verification. The more respected someone is, the less they should be exempt from scrutiny. Reputation can help good people do good things, but it can also become the perfect cover for a bad person to hide behind. The frightening part of Qasim's story is that he did not only kill someone, he performed the role of a helper. This is a very dangerous kind of manipulation. In real life, the person causing harm sometimes appears as the rescuer, the advisor, the protector, or the only person who understands the problem. When someone always leads you to the right answer, but never lets you examine the process, that is when you should pause. The Hong Kong story speaks to another layer of justice: what happens when a victim's family feels that the dead have been stripped of dignity a second time. Fu Min was murdered, and then her body was treated by the media like a shocking spectacle. Her brother was not only grieving her death, he was grieving the way she had been turned into a disturbing image for strangers to consume. That is a major lesson about the ethics of storytelling. In true crime, both storytellers and audiences need to remember that the victim is not a prop for fear. A case may be mysterious, strange, or disturbing, but at its centre was a person who once had a life, a family, habits, hopes, and dignity. If we focus only on the gruesome detail, we may accidentally allow the killer to define the victim by the final moment of their life. The ritual at the coffin in the Hong Kong story can be understood in different ways. Some may believe the victim's spirit went looking for the killer. Others may believe guilt and fear crushed the killer until he confessed. But no matter how you explain it, the important point remains: guilt does not disappear just because the person who committed the crime leaves the scene. It stays in the memory and the body, and sometimes it finds a way out. The Camp Horno stories shift the focus from crime to the feeling of being in the wrong place in the dark. One Marine goes looking for a magazine, two Marines on watch hear a little girl laughing, one Marine sees a woman in the barracks, one driver sees two old-looking Marines on the road. What connects these stories is not proof that ghosts are real. It is how environment exhaustion and history can make a person feel very small. In the military, people are trained to control fear through procedure. There is a post, a radio, a chain of command weapons duties and reports. But these stories are memorable because procedure does not answer everything. When a child's laughter comes from the trees at 2 a.m, the instruction to just ignore it does not make it less frightening. It only shows that systems have limits too. The practical lesson here is not to dismiss the instincts of people on the ground. One exhausted Marine may misread something. Two people may be tense at the same time. But when multiple independent people hear, see or feel the same unusual thing, it deserves to be recorded at the very least. In workplace safety, military training, and ordinary life, the feeling that something is not right should not be mocked too quickly. The story of the woman in the barracks also reminds us of the power of a second witness. If only one Marine had seen her, he might have doubted himself forever. But when another person heard the footsteps and also saw the face outside the window, the story changed. In life, when someone describes a strange or harmful experience, having one person listen seriously can keep them from being trapped inside self-doubt. The War Museum stories raise a deeper question. Can objects hold memory? A tank, a radio, a sword, a Huey helicopter? All of them once existed in situations where people were afraid, wounded, giving orders, calling for help, or dying. Even if you do not believe in the supernatural, it is hard to treat war objects as neutrally as a new chair in a store. Museums exist to educate, but education is not only dates and technical specifications. A helicopter that once carried wounded soldiers is not just machinery. It was the last or nearly last room some people ever occupied. A sword is not just beautiful steel. It was made to cut into human bodies. Looking at those objects with curiosity is natural, but that curiosity should be paired with respect. The radio story in the Tank Museum is powerful because it turns history into sound. A man's voice asks whether anyone is in the area, asks when something is going to arrive, and then becomes more desperate. Whatever the phenomenon was, the feeling it creates is real, the feeling of someone waiting for rescue. War history, when told properly, should not only excite people with weapons, it should make them hear the fear of the people inside those machines. The sword story in the attic shows another kind of danger, the confidence of walking into a place you do not understand. The medium believed he could handle whatever was attached to the armory. But half an hour later, he was found shouting at a wall and holding a sword over his head. Beyond the mystery, this is a lesson about arrogance. Not every place should be entered with the attitude of a performance. The Huey helicopter in the museum carries a sadder message. If its red beacon really did blink without power, that image feels like a leftover signal from war. But even if it was only a reflection, it still reminds us that some machines once served as the thin boundary between life and death. To most visitors, it is an artifact. To someone who was carried away from a battlefield, it may be the last memory of a friend. The Irish castle is the largest story because it is not centred on one object or one person, but on a place layered with too much death. Hunger, disease, sieges, prisons, executions screaming on the bridge bones in the courtyard, an unexplained damp patch on the wall. A place like that does not need ghosts to be frightening. Its history is already heavy enough. The educational lesson from the castle is that collective memory does not vanish just because a place sells admission tickets. When a site has witnessed enormous suffering, it should not be reduced to simple entertainment. A guide may tell stories to visitors, but the deeper duty is to keep the dead from being reduced to numbers. History should be told with accuracy and humility. If we gather all these stories together, one clear thread appears. Danger often enters ordinary life through familiar things. Police lights, cooking water, a healer, a funeral, a barracks, a museum, a historical artifact, a tourist castle. Familiarity lowers our guard, and when something familiar shifts even slightly, the body often notices before the mind does. So the most important message is this: learn to listen to small signals. A wrong taste, a person who is too calm, an answer that comes too quickly, a door that should not be open, a person appearing somewhere they could not have reached in time, a voice without a source. In storytelling, those details create suspense. In real life, they may be the chance to survive or uncover the truth. But listening to small signals does not mean living in paranoia. It means living awake. Ask one more question. Verify one more source. Call someone you trust. Report the strange detail. Write down the time, location, license plate, sound smell, and people present. These small actions do not make life unnatural. They simply create one more layer of protection between you and the unpredictable. Another message is this: do not let the appearance of authority, religion, profession, or history numb your judgment. Police can protect, but someone can abuse a badge. A healer can comfort, but someone can exploit faith. A museum can educate, but it can also turn pain into display if it is handled without respect. Finally, these stories remind us that the dead in some sense still need the living to behave properly. Behaving properly means investigating carefully, telling stories with dignity, refusing to turn victims into shock value, refusing to turn war history into toys, and refusing to turn places of suffering into cheap ghost hunts. Curiosity is natural, but curiosity should not consume compassion. If there is one closing thought for the entire episode, it is this: do not ignore the small thing that feels wrong. A woman did not come home. A meal tasted strange. A ritual led back to the killer's own house. An old radio asked if anyone was there. Each story began with a tiny crack in ordinary life, and behind that crack, the truth was waiting to be seen.